The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Wines have some of the highest pesticide levels in our food chain. This hour brought to you by ecowine.com. Pesticide-free wines, organic wines, imported from France by the Organic Wine Company, ecowine.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally.
Call 800-568-9889 or go to tomsbeets.com. That's 800-568-9889, Tom's Beets, THOMSBEETS.com.
It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Elaine Pagel's book, The Gnostic Gospels. This is from chapter 3, God the Father, God the Mother. Unlike many of his contemporaries among the deities of the ancient Near East, the God of Israel shared his power with no female divinity, nor was he the divine husband or lover of any. He can scarcely be characterized in any but masculine epithets: king, lord, master, judge, and father. Indeed, the absence of feminine symbolism for God marks Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in striking contrast to the world's other religious traditions. Whether in Egypt, Babylonia, Greece, and Rome, or in Africa, India, and North America, which abound in female symbolism. Jewish, Christian, and Islamic theologians today are quick to point out that God is not to be considered in sexual terms at all, yet the actual language they use daily in worship and prayer conveys a completely different message. Who, growing up Jewish or Christian tradition, has escaped the distinct impression that God is masculine? And while Catholics revere Mary as the mother of Jesus, they never identify her as divine in her own right. If she is the mother of God, she is not God the Mother, on an equal footing with God the Father. Christianity, of course, added the Trinitarian terms to the Jewish description of God, yet of the three divine persons, two, the Father and the Son, are described in masculine terms, and the third, the Spirit, suggests the sexlessness of the Greek neuter term for spirit, pneuma. Whoever investigates the early history of Christianity, the field called patristics, that is, study of the fathers of the church, will be prepared for the passage that concludes the Gospel of Thomas. Simon Peter said to the disciples, Let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life. Jesus said, I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman will make herself male, who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven. End of quote from the Gospel of Thomas. Strange as it sounds, this simply states what religious rhetoric assumes, that the men form the legitimate body of the community while women are allowed to participate only when they assimilate themselves to men. Other texts discovered at Nag Hammadi demonstrate one striking difference between these heretical sources and the orthodox ones. Gnostic sources continually use sexual symbolism to describe God. One might expect that these texts would show the influence of archaic pagan traditions of the mother goddess, but for the most part, their language is specifically Christian, unmistakably related to a Jewish heritage. Yet instead of describing a monastic and masculine God, many of these texts speak of God as a dyad who embraces both masculine and feminine elements. One group of Gnostic sources claims to have received a secret tradition from Jesus through James and through Mary Magdalene. Members of this group prayed to both the Divine Father and Mother. Quote, from thee, Father, and through thee, Mother, the two immortal names, parents of the divine being, and thou, dweller in heaven, humanity, of the mighty name. The end of the quote from the prayer. Other texts indicate that the authors had wondered to whom a single masculine God proposed, quote, let us make man in our image after our likeness, in Genesis 1:26. Since the Genesis account goes on to say that humanity was created, quote, male and female, some concluded that the God in whose image we are made must also be both masculine and feminine, both father and mother. How do these texts characterize the Divine Mother? I find no simple answer, since the texts themselves are extremely diverse. Yet we may sketch out three primary characterizations. In the first place, several Gnostic groups describe the Divine Mother as part of an original couple. Valentinius, the teacher and poet, begins with the premise that God is essentially indescribable. But he suggests that the divine can be imagined as a dyad, consisting in one part of the ineffable, the depth, the primal Father, and in the other of grace, silence, the womb, and mother of all. Valentinius reasons that silence is the appropriate complement of the Father, designating the former as feminine and latter as masculine because of the grammatical gender of the Greek words. He goes on to describe how silence receives, as in a womb, the seed of the ineffable source. From this she brings forth all the emanations of a divine being, ranged in harmonious pairs of masculine and feminine energies. Followers of Valentinius prayed to her for protection as the mother and as the mystical eternal silence. For example, Marcus, the magician, invokes her as grace, in Greek the feminine term charis. Quote, may she who is before all things, the incomprehensible and indescribable grace, fill you within and increase in you her own knowledge. End of quote from the Gospels. In his secret celebration of the Mass, Marcus teaches that the wine symbolizes her blood. As the cup of wine is offered, he prays that grace may flow into all who drink it. A prophet and visionary, Marcus calls himself the womb and recipient of silence, as she is of the Father. The visions he received of the divine being appeared, he reports, in female form. Another Gnostic writing, called the Great Announcement, quoted by Hippolytus in his Refutation of All Heresies, explains the origin of the universe as follows. Quote, from the power of silence appeared a great power, the mind of the universe, which manages all things, and is a male. The other, a great intelligence, is a female which produces all things. Following the gender of the Greek words for mind and intelligence, this author explains that these powers joined in union and are discovered to be in duality. The book, The Gnostic Gospel.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Greetings, my friends, patriots, lovers of democracy, truth, and justice, believers in peace, freedom, and the American way. We've got a lot of stuff to talk about today. The state of democracy is actually in some ways looking up in the United States. On the other hand, well, you know, Scott Pruitt, it's kind of looking down. We'll get to that. And a lot of Donald Trump news. We'll get to that. But I wanted to start with what happened a couple of days ago, April 12th specifically, when two young black men, Dante Robinson and Rashawn Nelson, were arrested at a Philadelphia Starbucks. We talked about this at some length yesterday, and there's you know, like more of the story is now coming out. They have met now with the CEO of Starbucks. They were on Good Morning America this morning. You recall yesterday when I was talking about this, I said, I'll bet those guys were feeling, you know, glad that they weren't killed. And as I was saying that, I was thinking, you know, for a white guy to say that, maybe it sounds like I'm saying, well, you know, they should be grateful. And certainly I didn't mean it that way. But, you know, it was a real thought in my mind. And I thought, you know, they've got to be thinking something like this, right? Well, sure enough, in the interview on Good Morning America this morning, Rashawn Nelson said, and I quote, "Anytime I'm encountered by cops, I can honestly say it's a thought that runs through my mind that he might not make it home alive. You never know what's going to happen." And, you know, I guess the good news is that one of the customers recorded this on a cell phone video. One of the customers unrelated to these guys or their meeting. These were two young businessmen who were black, who wanted to, you know, they were meeting a third person for a business meeting about a real estate deal. They'd been working on this for some time. TJ Holmes is tweeting, and I don't have independent verification of this, but it's gone totally insanely viral. I think it came out of the Good Morning America interview, which I did not see. But his tweet is, Dante Robinson and Rashawn Nelson arrived at Philly Starbucks at 4:35 for a meeting. Records show 9/11 was called at 4:37, 2 minutes later. This is, you know, it's a problem for Starbucks, obviously, but the bigger problem is this is a problem for America, that this kind of thing goes on. And that it's, you know, and that Starbucks is not, you know, entirely unique in this. They're not the only ones. I mean, you know, this whole thing of racism and sexism, and we see this. This is like the domain of the conservatives now. You know, Richard Nixon's Southern strategy and of course, centuries, millennia of misogyny have informed the Republican Party to the point that it's largely become the party of race hatred and suppression of women. For example, this from Raw Story, Travis Getty's. The headline, "Unhinged Conservatives Spew Venomous Hate at Author Over Viral Tweet About Daughter Asking for a Girl Dentist." Now, this doesn't have to do with race. This has to do with gender. But, you know, in many regards, these two things are very much intertwined because it's really all about white male privilege and white male power. And if you don't think that's a thing, just look at the pictures of all the presidents of the United States up until Barack Obama. Or just look at the pictures of the people who wrote the Constitution, or, you know, et cetera. You know, we look at the, you know, as of, say, 15, 20 years ago, look at every CEO, you know, of a publicly traded company in America. So anyhow, Alyssa Nutting is a writer, and she took her daughter to the dentist on Monday. And her 4-year-old, right, 4-year-old, this is what Alyssa tweeted. And this is just, you know, a tweet to her friends, right? She's a writer. She's got a Twitter following. "My daughter started crying at the dentist's office because the dentist is a boy. And the dentist said, 'Sorry, there are no girl dentists at this office.' And my daughter looked at me and said, 'Why do we come here?'" So, you know, it's an interesting opportunity. It's an interesting, you know, I'm sure Alyssa Nutting, when she tweeted this, thought, hey, this could turn into an interesting conversation. But, you know, right-wing crank Ben Shapiro, to quote Travis Getty over at rawstory.com, turned the death ray on Nutting by quoting her tweet and giving unsolicited parenting advice. Ben Shapiro tweets, "Perhaps you should have informed your daughter that as of 2014, 47.7% of all dental students were women, rather than letting her believe that your unrepresentative dentist's office is an indicator of widespread sexism." Well, that wasn't so bad, right? I mean, you know, Ben Shapiro quoting a statistic, okay, cool. But the problem was that Shapiro is followed by right-wing haters. I mean, as I said, this has become the base of the Republican Party. So-called conservative, quote, conservatives in quotes, nowadays means people who have completely bought into Nixon's Southern strategy and to generations of misogyny, of hatred of women or fear of women. And here comes the responses. After Shapiro retweeted this to his right-wing base, the right-wingers, Helen Wood, a Shapiro fan, tweets, Jesus Christ, imagine what she's going to be like when she grows up if you pander to this BS now. Tell her to shut her whiny ass up or her teeth will go moldy and fall out. A gun lover named Chris tweets, my daughter says your daughter whines too much and should just enjoy the nitrous. Justin Siddons, S-I-D-D-O-N-S, says, why don't you slap your little feminazi brat? Did she not ask the dentist which of the thousands of genders they identify as at that moment? Bigoted little, let's say turd, needs reporting to the gender Stasis. Another Trump supporter named Alf said, then you're a bad parent. Shapiro fan Ed Gee, G-E-E, says, anybody who raises daughters that cry because they meet a male professional should have Child Protective Services called on them. And there were a whole series of tweets calling for, the state to intervene, right? Darwin's Witness says, sounds like emotional abuse. CPS, Child Protective Services, should do a welfare check. Carmen Davis tweets, hope you stop acting like a whiny-ass girl. Nothing worse. Some others publicized the family's hometown. We're going to take you down. We're going to tell people where you live. Or tagged other prominent Twitter conservatives so that, the hate would keep on rolling. Finally, her husband, the author, Nutting's husband, her husband is named Dean Bakopoulos. He tweets, I can't believe my family's getting death threats because of this tweet. We like our dentist. And my wife actually helped our preschooler through the appointment because she's a good mom. But you men who've threatened violence over a funny thing our kids said, you got to be less fragile. Yeah. And then he also called out Twitter and its CEO for not taking action against these people. And he adds, rest assured, our 4-year-old got her teeth cleaned by our local dentist and did not destroy the patriarchy yesterday. Now, please leave our family alone. And meanwhile, in Kansas City, this just keeps on going, right? In Kansas City, a Kansas City firefighter by the name of Terrence Jeremy Skeen was in a bar in Overland Park, Kansas, a suburb of Kansas City. And a little black boy, 3-year-old black boy, walked up to him and he called him the N-word and spit on him. The manager called the police. Well, actually, let me give you the intervening story. So the 3-year-old was there because his 18-year-old uncle was having a birthday party in the restaurant. In the restaurant. And the child was running around. His grandfather caught up with him. And another person in the restaurant said, when your grandson was over by the bar, this guy, or over by the counter, that white guy over there spit on him and called him the N-word. And so Harris walks over, Harris is the grandfather, he walks over to Terrence Jeremy Skeen, the racist firefighter. This was at a Hooters. And says, the guy over the bar says, you just spit on my grandson. And the firefighter, Terrence Jeremy Skeen, starts yelling, F you, you N-word, I will spit on you. F you, I will shoot you. So the manager calls the police on the black people, not on the firefighter, not on the white firefighter. And when the cops get there, the firefighter says, it's okay, I'm a firefighter. Well, when the news got out, he was suspended. He's back on the job. And in New Jersey, there's an LA fitness gym in Secaucus, New Jersey, where a couple of black guys were members. And the manager, one of them, the manager says to one of them as he's, walking around, you didn't pay, get out. The guy's a member. And so he walks up to the front desk and asks the woman at the front desk, this, you can see this story at rawstory.com too by Brad Reed, walks up to the manager and says, would you please scan my membership card here? She scans it. It brings up his membership with his picture and everything. She says, yep, you're you and you're a member. Oh, excuse me. She doesn't say anything. Here, after the scan shows that he's a member of the gym, the woman simply stands up and doesn't say anything as she walks away. The second video shows him being confronted by the gym manager, who tells him he can't shoot video in the gym. There's a cop in there, and the manager says to the cop, "You got to stop them from recording me." And the cop says, "This is not illegal activity." And in the final video, the gym manager is in the process of terminating the man's gym membership. LA Fitness in Secaucus, New Jersey. Why are they terminating his membership? Apparently because he doesn't want to get kicked out because he's black. This is all one thing. The 4-year-old white girl, the black guys, you know, in whether it's Starbucks or LA Fitness or in Hooters, a 3-year-old black kid in Hooters. This is all one thing. This is all about white male power and the attempts by the Republican Party and so-called conservatives to reach out to white men and say, you should be afraid of women coming into the workplace. This goes back to Rush Limbaugh's whole feminazi rant from the 80s. You should be afraid of women coming into the workplace. You should be afraid of black people. You should be afraid of Hispanics. Didn't somebody tell you they're all rapists and murderers? Be afraid, be afraid, be afraid. They're not like you. They want to take away your power. That has become the core conservative message. That's what Trump became president on.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And that is so very wrong. We'll be back. Welcome back. Our lines are open, by the way, 202-808-9925. Rashawn Nelson and Dante Robinson. This is, you know, in a way, this is kind of a great thing. I mean, I'm sure that these guys don't think of it as a great thing. But, you know, a great thing is sort of like, you know, in the Selma March, when we all saw the videotape of John Lewis and you know, everybody else having the stuffing knocked out of them. Right, that even makes it sound like it's less brutal than it was. Being brutalized by the Alabama police, the Alabama State Police and the Selma police, because the subculture of white people in this country who don't know what's going on, and I think that's probably a shrinking number. But up until recently, it's been a substantial number, and whether they know what's going on or not, they're willing to say, you know, it's not my problem. I got my white privilege. I got my male privilege. Life is good. You know, to hell with all this stuff. This is, you know, this is a serious issue, and it's not just a serious issue because you know, women are being abused. You know, Harvey Weinstein, from Harvey Weinstein down to the whole thing with the dentist. You know, kids, black men. It's not just because of the victims. It's because when you have a culture, when you have a society that is grounded in the power and supremacy of one particular gender and one particular race, you have a society that is unsustainable. We saw this in South Africa. We have seen this, you know, we saw this in Germany in the 30s. We have seen this all around the world. And people are waking up, countries are waking up. Particularly the Scandinavian countries and Iceland. I mean, Iceland has been a matrilineal society for millennia, or for centuries anyway. And I mean, you know, you must have at least, you know, 45% of your, 40%, I think it is in Norway, of your elected officials have to be women. Because they realize that a diverse society is actually a more resilient society. This really ultimately has to do with resilience, with the ability of a society, of a culture, to survive shocks, to survive difficulties, to survive stresses. Just like in an ecosystem, diversity produces strength. Just like in in any kind of biological system, the more diversity there is in that system, the more organs you have functioning in your body, the more different kinds of plants are growing within 50 miles of you, the more likely the plants are to survive, the more likely you are to survive. Diversity is a good thing. Now, I realize that there are some people who are very comfortable with their homogeneity, with the, hey, it's all just, us white guys here. But that, like I said, that is unsustainable. So anyhow, we'll pick up some of your phone calls after this. I've got a bunch of other topics, too, we want to get to as we continue through the program. Stick around. We'll be right back. Welcome back. 23 minutes past the hour. I was just saying, this is not just about, that poor little girl who wanted a female dentist, or, that poor little 3-year-old black boy who, had a brutal encounter with racism, or, the poor guys who were in Starbucks. It's not about the victims. I mean, obviously, we need to honor them and hold them up and learn from their experience and empathize with them. But ultimately, it's not about the victims. It's about America. It's about our society. Are we going to let the George Wallaces, the modern-day George Wallaces, the white men who run the Republican Party and the white billionaires who fund the Republican Party and fund this kind of Southern strategy stuff, are we going to let them basically take our country down? Because diversity produces strength. Diversity is a good thing. You want as many different parts of your body functioning as possible. You need diversity in the ecosystem that is your body. You want as many different kinds of plants and trees growing in the forest and in the fields around your house as possible, because diverse ecosystems are stable ecosystems. You want a lot of different kinds of people, a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different languages, a lot of different cultures, a lot of different religions together in a society to build a society that is resilient. Because when you have a society, when you have a culture that is essentially a monoculture, that is just one single gender of one single race who controls the whole game, and that has been the case in the United States for 230 years. White men have run this country and the world, by and large. And what has happened? Look at the wars we have had. Look at the violence that has been inflicted. And that violence comes home. I talked yesterday about how back during the Vietnam era, we used to, the phrase in the anti-war movement was the war always comes home. And it did. PTSD, trauma, drug addiction, suicide. And we're seeing the same thing now with the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria. Where else are we? Egypt. I mean, on and on the list goes. Well, propping up Egypt. But you get it. And as that violence comes home, we need diversity. Well, obviously we shouldn't be having the violence coming home. But diversity is a strength. It is not a weakness. George Wallace, Donald Trump, the men who would harass a 4-year-old girl for wanting a female dentist, Ben Shapiro's followers, the men who would, apparently the manager of Starbucks was a white woman. The white people who are freaked out about black men and the white cops who are freaked out about black men. These are all symptoms of people who have been living in essentially a bubble. Fascinating article over at Huffington Post right now about Cape Town, South Africa. The city has run out of water, basically. And people of all races are coming together in some really remarkable ways. And it's just, I just want to refer you to it because it's just fascinating. What happens when a stressor is introduced? Whether it's war, whether it's violence, whether it's drought. What happens when a stressor is introduced? In a multicultural society, things actually get stronger.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Now, that's clearly not the story that right-wing hate hosts are selling when they're selling your survival foods. You know, hey, white people, stock up. But it's true. For the Thom Hartmann University Book Club today, we're reading from Speeches and Addresses by Delphin Delmas. Delphin Delmas was the lawyer who single-handedly and for free, pro bono, saved the redwoods in California. And then he went and on behalf of Santa Clara County, he argued the Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad case before the Supreme Court. And this is a book that he published in 1909. This is the actual original first edition. You can find reprints on the internet. In 1909, he published a collection of his speeches, including his presentation to the Supreme Court on corporate personhood, which I am reading to you. The shield behind which it attacks the Constitution and laws of California is the 14th Amendment. It argues that the amendment guarantees to every person within the jurisdiction of the state the equal protection of the laws, that a corporation is a person, that therefore it must receive the same protection as that accorded to all other persons in like circumstances. The special argument advanced is that if an individual owns property and a corporation owns precisely the same kind of property, the law protects them both equally in the use and enjoyment of the property. And for the protection it affords the government can demand no greater or different return, the shape of taxes, than it demands from the individual. That argument I beg leave to controvert. He says, in my mind, the fallacy, if I may be permitted to so term it, of the argument lies in the assumption that corporations are entitled to be governed by the laws that are applicable to natural persons. That, as it is said, results from the fact that corporations are persons, and that the last clause of the 14th Amendment refers to all persons without distinction. The defendant has been at pains to show that corporations are persons, and that being such, they are entitled to the protection of the 14th Amendment. There was scarcely need of the array of learning and elaborate disquisition which has been displayed on this point. Blackstone says persons are divided by the law into natural persons or artificial persons. Natural persons as such are such as the God of nature formed us. Artificial are such as were created and derived by artificial laws for the purposes of society and government, which are called corporations or bodies politic. This definition suggests at once that it would seem unnecessary to dwell on that though a corporation is a person, it is not the same kind of person as a human being, and need not of necessity enjoy all the rights. When the law says any person being of sound mind and of age of discretion may make a will, or any person having arrived at the age of majority may marry, I presume the most ardent advocate of equality of protection would hardly contend that corporations must enjoy the right of testamentary disposition or of contracting matrimony. Keep in mind, this was 1886. The equality between persons spoken of in the 14th Amendment obviously means equality between persons of the same nature or class, and not equality between persons whose very natures are absolutely dissimilar. Equality between human beings, if the rights of natural persons are involved. Equality between corporations of the same class, if the rights of artificial persons are involved. The whole history of the 14th Amendment demonstrates beyond dispute that its whole scope was and object was to establish equality between men, an attainable result, and not to establish equality between natural and artificial beings, an impossible result. He goes on to say, could Congress have by any possibility meant to confer upon artificial persons the same rights and the same respects as were enjoyed by white citizens? Could it be, for instance, have meant that a corporation should have the same right to give evidence as white citizens? And as to contracts, may not the state which creates corporations impose certain limitations upon their power or right to make contracts, because the right of a white citizen to make a contract extends to all things not forbidden by law. Must the law of a corporation be coextensive with it? Under this leveling statute, was it intended to abolish the right of the state to impose terms and limits upon its own creatures? Again, keep in mind this is 1886. Again, as to the burdens, the statute says that the taxes, license, extractions of every kind and none other, which may be demanded from white citizens, shall be demanded from all persons within the state or territory. Here, the burden to which a white citizen is subjected is the standard of measurement. To justify a tax, license, or exaction, it must first be shown that it is demanded from white citizens. If it is not, it cannot be demanded from any other person within the state. Was this meant to apply to corporations? Was it intended that corporations should be subjected to no tax, license, or exaction that was not imposed upon white citizens, any law or statute to the contrary notwithstanding? It is certain that this law has never been so understood or interpreted by any state. In other words, no state has ever said a corporation is a person. And if it is now to be so interpreted, what, I ask, is to become of the vast mass of legislation in all the states by which taxes, licenses, and exactions are demanded from corporations, where none whatsoever is demanded from white citizens? To take a single illustration, by the statute of Massachusetts, every savings bank incorporated under the laws of the Commonwealth pays a tax of 1.5% on its deposits. No such tax is imposed upon any individual or citizen. This court has held that this was a tax on the corporation, the person. That the 14th Amendment was intended to secure equality between persons, which in the nature of things were equal, and not between one class of persons and another class entirely dissimilar, seems so plain that the defendant itself is at times compelled to admit it. As good a definition as I could desire of the meaning of the words equal protection under the law, I find in the arguments formerly delivered here in the San Mateo case by the learned gentleman the opposite. The Delphin Delmas is the author, Speeches and Addresses. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. And there's a lot of other news here, but I think that this is a really important conversation that America needs to be having right now. And therefore, Amin in Whittier, California. Hey, Amin, thanks for watching us on YouTube. What's up?
Thank you, Tom. Hey, so I wanted to elaborate more on the racism topic that you brought up. And, you know, for example, the Starbucks case that just happened, we can all see, you know, Starbucks' lack of, you know, instant response to the situation is harmful. But even further than that, so you know how they just came out yesterday or a few days ago about how they're going to combat racism by closing down stores and instill training in the employees, right?
Right.
So, however, the fine line, if you read whatever they say, is that they're going to be supporting the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, which, as we all know, is supporting racism in Israel because, you know, the U.S. staunchly supports them. So I would say the racism, we support it, not just in our own home.
How does Starbucks support? I don't get it. What's the, you know, I don't see any link between Starbucks and Israel unless they've got franchises there, which is, you know, irrelevant.
Well, for example, the Anti-Defamation League, they actually do training for the Israeli military and their policing of
right, but they're not doing training for Starbucks. I mean, you know, you're not making your point here. Toya in Oklahoma City. Hey, Toya, what's on your mind today?
I don't get it.
Toya, you got to listen to your phone, not your radio. Devin in Houston, Texas. Hey, Devin, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, how you doing today?
Good. What's up?
Do you think the basis of a lot of the racism you see from white males in general is that they've been trained to see minorities, homosexuals, and women as an existential threat?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Not just as a threat, but also there's also this assumption of superiority. You know, white privilege also includes white supremacy. And there's a great story over Democratic Underground about this. Apparently the person who posted it is a black woman executive, and she was a senior executive in this company and had a reserved parking place just for her car. And she parked there, and some white guy who was like 4 levels down on the food chain at the company, who she didn't know and he didn't know her, stopped her as she was getting out of her car and said, "This is reserved parking right here." And she said, "Yeah, I know, I'm fine." And she starts walking toward the building, and he jumps in front of her and says, "No, that's reserved parking. You can't park there." And she's like, "I'm good." And she walks around him and goes into the building, and she calls his boss's boss, who works for her, and says, "This just happened to me." And they sent the guy to sensitivity training. But, you know, I mean, this white guy could not apparently conceive of the possibility that his boss's boss's boss was a black woman.
Yeah, yeah. It's like, even if you say like something that's historical about, let's say, a black person, their first thought is that can't be true. Even with proof, they would just deny it because they've just taught. That's how, you know, when you enslave someone, you have to destroy their history and destroy them as a person to justify your behavior. That's why some of them honestly say, look, if minorities are become equal to us in the amount of people, like, you know, in size, population, they're going to do to us what we did to them because they have to justify them being so horrible. Well, that guy must be horrible, just as horrible as me, so I'm justified in being this way.
Right.
You know.
Yeah. Yeah. It's or worse. You know, the assumption that person must be worse, or that person must be, you know, there must be something consequentially wrong. Devin, thank you for the call. Thanks for listening to SiriusXM. Lowell in Salem, Oregon. Hey, Lowell, what's up?
Hey, Tom. I had a couple of comments about the racism and resiliency of society.
Mm-hmm.
Lee Camp had a great, I'm not sure if she's a psychologist or, anyway, she was Dr. Harriet Fraad, F-R-A-A-D.
Mm-hmm.
And you could look up his show on 125, 2018.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, she talked about the how society isolates the male culture here. And what happens is males have, you know, basically their entire identity is wrapped in their jobs and such.
Right.
And, you know, that's what kind of leads down this path when they start to lose those type of things to the outburst of violence, because they have no, you know, they're taught to isolate, or, you know, society.
Oh yeah, the first question that is typically asked of a man in a cocktail party kind of environment, or, you know, any sort of social environment where you're meeting somebody for the first time, is, "What do you do?" In other words, not who are you, but who are you by route of what do you do? And so if what do you do becomes, you know, well, I used to be an executive, but now I work as a clerk in the shoe store, that's a humiliating, or now I'm unemployed. That's a humiliating, or I used to have a good union job doing construction work, and now I'm, you know, doing Slurpees at 7-Eleven. That's a humiliating response for many, you know, white men who formerly enjoyed a middle-class job in the United States before we started exporting all our manufacturing jobs.
Yes, and you know, they become therefore more susceptible to these types of manipulations. And
right.
So, you know, in a lot of ways, it seems like, you know, fixing a lot of the economic problems would start to help a lot of these type of social problems.
It absolutely does, and this was the point I made the other day when we had that woman on from Project 21 who was arguing that we should work, you know, that there should be a work requirement for food stamps, and her basic premise, I think, was, or generally the basic premise of conservatives who pitch this point of view, is that poor people are just looking, they're just con artists, they're just looking to take our money. Right, us wealthy people, and therefore we've got to make it really hard for them to take our money. We've got to, you know, make them jump through lots and lots of hoops and force them to do all kinds of humiliating stuff if they're going to take our money. And the reality is that those exact same people, the same, in this case, you know, largely African Americans in the city of Detroit, were, you know, had a good solid middle class life, many of them, when manufacturing was really rocking and rolling in Detroit, and now not so much. And that doesn't have to do with the color of their skin, outside of the way that society has, you know, constructed an economy that harms them, but it has more to do with the fact that there's simply no jobs there anymore. And yeah, people would universally, people would rather have a job than be on welfare. Lowell, thank you for the call. Well said. Jolanda in Spanaway, Washington. Hey, Jolanda, what's on your mind today?
Hi, it's Yolanda, but
Yolanda, I'm sorry.
on the racism issue.
Mm-hmm.
I'm 64. I grew up in L.A., and both my parents, my grandparents were from Mexico, though my mother was born here. But I look like a little Irish girl with red hair, bright red hair, and freckles, and so did my brother. And my mother looked like a little indigenous Indian, from Mexico. But my mom, we would walk downtown, and I can remember this. I mean, it still causes so much pain that, my little sister, who was darker than me, that looked like my mom, and here's two little redheaded people, and I remember a woman coming up, "Oh, what beautiful children you have." And my mom said, "Well, thank you." She goes, "Yeah, your little girl's cute too, but the kids you're taking care of are just beautiful."
Oh, geez.
She goes, "Excuse me, ma'am, they're all my children."
Right.
This woman argued with my mother, telling her that those children were not hers.
That being you.
Me.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's got to be a
that
tough one,
happened
Yolanda.
At least 3 times in my lifetime.
Yeah.
As a child.
Yeah. Yeah.
That they denied my mother and talked to her like she was gum on somebody's shoe.
Yeah.
So I've always felt it, because people talk differently around me because they don't know who I am.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a little bit of a rebel, as they say.
Yeah.
And as soon as someone would start to say something, then I would answer them back in Spanish perfectly as I do, because I'm totally bilingual.
Mm-hmm.
And then they would be in total shock.
Yeah.
And I still have to do that today as a grown woman.
That's incredible.
Perdóname, yo soy mexicana. No me hablas así. I will tell them immediately.
Yeah.
And that's my gentle way, because I really want to punch him in the face, but of course we can't do that.
Yeah, there you go.
And so I'm so blessed for your point of view, because just thank you, honey. Just thank you.
Well, thank you, Yolanda. Thanks for your kind comments, but mostly thank you for sharing a really important story with us. I appreciate it. Toya in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Toya, your thoughts?
Hi, Tom.
Hey, Toya.
Can you hear me, Tom?
Just fine, yeah.
I just want to thank you, Tom, for your heart. You're such a good man. Thank you for your program, your issues. Thank you for just having a wonderful spirit.
Well, thank you, Toya, but I have to tell you, I'm doing this not out of the goodness of my heart, but because I'm concerned that this kind of insanity, this racist, misogynistic insanity, and that's what it is tearing my country apart, too. I mean,
yes, sir. Yes, sir, it is. And my heart hurts, because I am an African lady who has brothers. I have a grandbaby. He's in the 9th grade. And every time, and even my daughter, it just pains me when I hear stories of different families going through this racism, knowing that when we wake up in the morning, we don't know if we're going to be confronted with a cop whose heart is not in the right place. Yeah. It is so sad, Tom. And just let me quickly just say this. I noticed it really started for me when President Obama became president. The Republican Party, they were so disrespectful to him. Mm-hmm. And it was so hurtful, especially, I don't know if he was the senator. I don't know what the guy's name was. So when he did the State of the Union and he yelled out, "You lied," mm-hmm. I thought that was so disrespectful.
Yeah.
And then you got this man in office. For me, Tom, I feel in my heart that he's not right. I feel in my heart that he's racism. And I also feel in my heart, and this is just me, Tom, that most of the Republican parties, to me, I think they're racist too, because if they wasn't, they would denounce half of this stuff.
You would think so.
Mitch McConnell and Ryan, they need to step up or they need to leave. Because as long as they're in office, you got people out here, sadly to say, who are racist, and they're feeding into this, and they're doing these things because of the leadership. But I just had to get that off my chest, and I just want you to know that there are people out here listening to you. Thank you for your voice, Tom.
Thank you,
I really
Terry.
appreciate you.
Thank you for your voice, and I really appreciate you and your call, because it was so spot on. And thank you so much, and thank you for sharing your story with us too. It's much appreciated. And thank you for listening to SiriusXM. We'll continue the conversation in just a moment. But this is, you know, President Obama gave this marvelous speech in Philadelphia about race. We're still here, or there.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
I think that there's a broad awakening happening, and that encourages me. But the forces of pushback and the willingness of Republicans to use race as a wedge terrifies me. Welcome back. Max in Prescott Valley, Arizona, watching us on Free Speech TV. Hey, Max, what's up?
Hey, Tom. You know, I think they're playing us like a bad VCR, you know, beginning, middle, the end. You know what I mean by that? Gen X, 65 to 81.
I don't know what you mean. Or I think I may, but why don't you explain it, Max?
Okay, Gen X, born between 1965 and 1981.
Right.
You know, when they say media, these right-wing Republican nuts, they're meaning non-ethnic diversity, or they mean that they don't want diversity, and they only say media to blame, point one finger at us, and then three are pointing right back.
Media, M-E-D-I-A? I don't understand what you're saying, Max.
Media, you know, the news media.
Right.
And it's being lonely here in Arizona, which is ethically and culturally non-diversity at all.
Yeah. Well, you've got a very small black population there. You've got a very large or fairly substantial Hispanic population. But, you know, yeah, I get it. You're concerned about the right wing pushing fear and anger on society. Max, thanks. Nice comment. Kenny in Amarillo, Texas. Hey, Kenny, what's on your mind? Thanks for watching Free Speech.
Well, I had a situation that kind of broadened my view about racism.
Mm-hmm.
I was on a flight between Taiwan and Bangkok, Thailand, and I got to talk to this young girl next to me, and she had her family support her as she flew between two countries every 6 months so that she could get an education in the United States, and then she could live, you know, but both places were outside of her native country. And she said it didn't matter where she went. She always ran into racism.
Was she ethnically Chinese?
I think she was Indonesian or something.
Yeah,
I really don't remember what her origin
Southeast
was.
Asian, sure.
Yeah, but basically, so anyway, I started going around and talking to other people on the airplane, and there was about 3 different other people that just bounced between 2 different countries every 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
But all the people that I talked to, which was about 5 or 6, they all said it doesn't matter where you go. If you weren't born there, you know, you run into racism, you run into the same problems that we're running into the United States.
Well, it's essentially tribalism, Kenny. And, you know, I was talking about this yesterday, that we are wired, and this is where we have to overcome not just cultural conditioning, but actual biology. We are wired to protect our families. We are, you know, and every species is, and every subgroup within species are, and as far as I know. And so when someone comes along who looks substantially different than us, or talks substantially different than us, or in some other way signifies that they are not like us, our immediate response is, do they represent a danger to me? Because, you know, the top predator in the world is the human race. And that's a real issue. Kenny, thanks for the call. That's a real issue that we have to confront, that this is a natural response. It doesn't mean it's a healthy response. Or at least it seems to be a natural response. But you know, this is something that we really have to take on. We'll be right back. Our conversation here about race in America. Buck in San Clemente, California. Buck, you wanted to weigh in.
Yeah, Tom. I saw a PBS NewsHour last night, and I was just blown away. They had about a 10, 15-minute segment on black pregnancy, and it's perfect.
Black women are more likely to die in the United States as a result of pregnancy than in any other developed country in the world. And
3 to 4 times more likely to die.
Yeah.
3 to 4 times, Tom.
And the same is true of their babies.
The black infants are more than twice as likely to die as white infants.
Yep.
Twice as, and I mean, what is the ratio of, of whites to blacks? I mean, it's just incredible, incredible. More than twice as likely to die than white infants. And that gap is wider today than it was in 1850 when black women were slaves.
That's amazing.
And they brought up a study that you had mentioned a couple years ago about women in war zones, pregnant women in war zones, how they their babies were traumatized, they themselves were traumatized.
Right.
And that is what they said this is the deal, because black women are looked down upon whenever they're in they are felt less intelligent. They're like.
Oh, black people in hospitals are less likely to get painkillers at the levels of white people. I mean, there's like this assumption that all these assumptions about race that are all BS.
Another mind-blowing thing is Serena Williams, the tennis player. She's very wealthy. She had problems with her pregnancy. She almost died after she had the baby, and they relate it to just the black women's stress. It was just terrible.
Yeah.
It was terrible.
Well, thank you for the heads up on that, Buck. I'll see if I can find it. Thank you for the call too. Baha, am I saying that right? New Orleans, Louisiana. Hello.
Hello.
Is it Baha? Am I saying your name right?
Yes, my name is Baha.
Okay.
Or Baja, like Baja, California.
Yeah. Okay. So what's your story? You were a military translator and a medic?
Well, what I do is I'm a respiratory therapy. I was in Texas. Right now I'm unemployed, but I'm looking for work.
Mm-hmm.
And the prejudice that I felt after 9/11. Before 9/11, I could get a job anywhere, and I had no problem whatsoever.
Do you look Middle Eastern? Is that the problem?
Oh yeah, I look Middle Eastern, quite Middle Eastern.
Yeah.
Especially if I have a beard on.
Yeah.
I shave now, but
well, I had to do. I shaved and cut my hair because I was tired of being stopped every time I went through airport security.
Yeah.
And that's a minor inconvenience. All people should have that as their biggest problem. I mean, that's another dimension of my own white privilege. But anyhow, back to you, Baha.
Yeah. Well, after 9/11, the hate that I got in Texas was just unbelievable. So we moved to Louisiana, and it's of course the only reason we moved here is because my mom was here, and it's not very much better here at all. And
how does that show up? Can you give me an example or a story?
Oh, I go to the VA, and I used to go to the VA. I don't go to the VA anymore, and I really believe that I got treated different. My wife is an American-born white person, and the looks that we got, and people, and we always kind of knew that we were a mixed couple, but we never saw ourselves as a mixed couple.
Yeah.
But they made it quite clear that we're a mixed couple here.
Well, George W. Bush was using this fear of the other, and then that Israeli show that was all about how the Palestinians are coming to get us got moved over to the United States and reinvented as the Homeland TV show, and it's like there's all this stuff. Baha, I'm sorry we're hitting the break here. I'd love to hear more, but I have no control over this part of the clock. Thank you so much for calling in.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Wines have some of the highest pesticide levels in our food chain. This hour brought to you by ecowine.com. Pesticide-free wines, organic wines, imported from France by the Organic Wine Company, ecowine.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally.
Call 800-568-9889 or go to thomsbeats.com. That's 800-568-9889, Thom's Beets, THOMSBEETS.com.
It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Notes on Debates in the Federal Convention of 1787, reported by James Madison. That would be the Constitutional Convention where everybody got together and wrote the Constitution. This is from Wednesday, August 22nd. Article 7, Section 4, resumed. Mr. Sherman was, and this is Madison's notes, so he's reporting what Mr. Sherman said. Mr. Sherman was for leaving the clause as it stands. He disapproved of the slave trade. Yet as the states were now possessed of the right to import slaves, as the public good did not require it to be taken from them, and as it was expedient to have as few objections as possible to the proposed scheme of government. The proposal, by the way, was to ban the importation of slaves after 1808 with the assumption that the states would rapidly end slavery shortly thereafter. And you'll hear that in just a minute. It was expedient to have as few objections as possible to the proposed scheme of government. He thought it best to leave the matter as we find it. He observed that the abolition of slavery seemed to be going on in the U.S. and that the good sense of the several states would probably by degrees complete it soon. He urged on the convention the necessity of dispatching its business. Colonel Mason spoke. This infernal traffic originated in the avarice of British nations. The British government constantly checked the attempts of Virginia to put a stop to it. The present question concerns not the importing of slaves alone, but the whole Union. The evil of having slaves was experienced during the late war. Had slaves been treated as they might have been by the enemy, they would have proved dangerous instruments in their hands. What he's talking about is the British offering slaves freedom if they came and fought for the British. But their folly dealt by the slaves as it did by the Tories. He mentioned the dangerous insurrections of the slaves in Greece and Sicily and the instructions given to by Cromwell to the commissioners sent to Virginia to arm the servants and slaves in case other means of obtaining its submission should fail. Maryland and Virginia had had already prohibited the importation of slaves expressly. North Carolina had done the same in substance. All this would be in vain if South Carolina and Georgia were at liberty to import. The Western people are already calling out for slaves for their new lands and will fill that country with slaves if they can be got through South Carolina and Georgia. Slavery discourages arts and manufactures. The poor despise labor when performed by slaves. They prevent the immigration of whites. They produce the most pernicious effect on manners. Every master of slaves is born a petty tyrant. They bring the judgment of heaven on a country. As nations cannot be rewarded or punished in the next world, they must be in this. By an inevitable chain of causes and effects, providence punishes national sins by national calamities. He lamented that some of our Eastern brethren had, from a lust of gain, embarked in this nefarious traffic. As to the states being in possession of the right to import, this was the case with many other rights now to be properly given up. He held it essential in every point of view that when the general government should have the power to the general government should have the power to prevent the increase of slavery. Mr. Ellsworth rose to spoke. As he had never owned a slave, could not judge on the effects of slavery on character. He said, however, that if it was to be considered in a moral light, we ought to go farther and free those already in our country. As slaves also multiply so fast in Virginia and Maryland that it is cheaper to raise than import them, whilst in the sickly rice swamps foreign supplies are necessary, if we go no further than is urged, we shall be unjust toward South Carolina and Georgia. Let us not intermeddle. As population increases, poor laborers will be so plenty as to render slaves useless. Slavery in time will not be a speck in our country. Provision is already made in Connecticut for abolishing it, and the abolition has already taken place in Massachusetts. As to the danger of insurrections from foreign influence, that will become a motive to kind treatment of the slaves and former slaves. Mr. Pinckney, if slavery be wrong, it is justified by the example of all the world. He cited the case of Greece, Rome, and other ancient states, the sanction given by France, England, Holland, and other modern states. In all ages, one half of mankind had been slaves. If the southern states were let alone, they would probably of themselves stop importations. He would himself, as a citizen of South Carolina, vote for it. An attempt to take away the right as proposed will produce serious objections to the Constitution, which he wished to see adopted. General Pinckney rose to speak and declared it to be his firm opinion that if himself and all his colleagues were to sign the Constitution and use their personal influence, it would be of no avail towards obtaining the assent of their constituents. South Carolina and Georgia cannot do without slaves. As to Virginia, she will gain by stopping the importation. Her slaves will rise in value, and she has more than she wants. It would be unequal to require South Carolina and Georgia to confederate on such unequal terms. He said the royal assent before the Revolution had never been refused to South Carolina, as to Virginia. He contended that the importation of slaves would be for the interest of the whole Union. The more slaves, the more produce to employ the carrying trade, the more consumption also, and the more of this, the more of revenue for the common treasury. He admitted it to be reasonable that slaves should be dutied like other imports, but should consider a rejection of the clause as an exclusion of South Carolina from the Union. Mr. Baldwin rose to speak, said he had conceived national objects alone to be before the convention, not such as like the present were of a local nature. Georgia was decided on this point. That state was always hitherto supposed a general government. And on it goes. It's a fascinating insight into what these guys were thinking and debating. Fulfillment for
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back to our program. On the line with us is our old friend, Professor Richard Wolff, the economist, co-founder of democracyatwork.info, author most recently of Capitalism's Crisis Deepens, Essays on the Global Economic Meltdown. And you can tweet him at Prof. Wolff, Profwolff, or Democracy at Work. His other website is rdwolff.com. Professor Wolff, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Tom. Glad to be here.
It is always marvelous to have you. So yesterday I went off on an extended rant about two articles that were on the front page of the Financial Times. The top article was headlined, the International Monetary Fund sounds alarm on excessive global borrowing with $164 trillion owed. And the other one was about how the banks in the United States are starting to expand their credit offerings to consumers. They're expanding their essentially subprime real estate and car loans. They're pushing credit cards really, really hard. We had a number of people who called up and talked about how they're getting more and more credit card solicitations. The banks are just creating an orgy of debt in the United States. And it seemed to me like these two stories were delivering very opposite messages. Your thoughts, and then I want to get into the UK Labour Party and their report on alternative models of ownership and how that might even relate to this. Your thoughts on the possibility that there's a debt bomb about to go off in our face?
Yeah, well, I think it's a very serious danger, a serious threat. We are examining, as we look at the debt levels, a situation that is frighteningly like what preceded the crash in 2008. And indeed, it is like crashes of the past, going back 200 or 300 years. It leads you to want to shake your head in disbelief that so little of history can be learned, that indeed we have to always go through it again, each time a bit more tragically than the time before. Let's look at this particular one. After the crash of, well, the two crashes in the new millennium, the one in 2000 itself, so-called dot-com crash, and then the even bigger one in 2008 and 9, that literally took down the world economy. After both of those, one of the strategies used to try to stabilize this horribly unstable system of capitalism was to drop interest rates, to pump money into the economy by really lowering interest rates to levels we have never seen before, barely above zero, and in a number of countries, including ours from time to time, actually even below zero to negative interest rates. Well, it doesn't take a genius to understand in the irrational, individualistic capitalism we live in, the business community particularly is going to take advantage of low interest rates to borrow in a way they wouldn't have dared to do before. Now, that was not the intent, but with the effort to stabilize capitalism by monetary policy, dropping interest rates so low, you basically invited the irrationality of this system to go crazy. And correspondingly, individuals started borrowing even though they got hurt in the 2008 crash. They started borrowing afterwards, and businesses have been on a borrowing binge now for a long time, even going so far as to borrow money for no other purpose than to increase the dividends they pay out to their shareholders, increase the pay packages for their top executives, and so on. Yeah. So yes, I'm afraid I have to say that this system's very mechanisms for coping with one kind of instability set up the terms and the conditions for the next kind of crash in an endless kind of attempt to manage this out-of-control system without questioning whether or not a different system might work better.
It seems like with debt, we go through a three-step cycle that is continuously repeating. We have an economy that is relatively stable, where debt is in balance and at appropriate levels. Then we go into the speculative phase, where everybody starts using debt to gamble on the value of their homes. This was the big deal in the 2006, 7, 8. Seminars being posted on every telephone pole, get rich quick and all this kind of stuff. Back in the 20s, it was buying stock with debt. And then the third phase is basically the Ponzi scheme phase, where people are using debt they go into debt, or companies in this case, like you just described, essentially just to siphon some of that debt off so they can stick it in their pocket, knowing that the whole thing is going to collapse, but they're trying to get their piece of it while it's still intact. And then when it does collapse, it restarts. Is that right. Accurate?
Absolutely, particularly that last point, if I could reinforce that, it's very, very important, that it is a kind of grab my piece and run away before the whole house of cards comes tumbling down. So you borrow like crazy, and you count either on having enough that you can weather the disaster, which of course the mass of people can't, or if you're really big, that you can go to the government and say, I'm so indebted that if you don't bail me out, I will default on all these debts and thereby take the whole economy down with me, which we saw all the major banks and the insurance companies basically, or many of them, do in 2008, 2009, and into 2010. It's just an amazing thing to have to read that in the hunt for profits, in the competition for more profits, banks are lending to riskier and riskier borrowers as if the history of the last 10 years had never happened.
So how would these alternative models of membership that the UK Labour Party has now endorsed, cooperatives, municipal and locally owned, locally led ownership, and national ownership, nationalization, how would they address this specific issue that we're talking about? Or do they do that by a larger cleaning up, basically, of the excesses of unregulated capitalism?
A little bit of both. I think the idea is that you establish, and to get to the root of it, you establish that the decisions in economics are not going to be made anymore under the iron rule of capitalism, which is maximize profits. You don't survive in capitalism unless you maximize profits. There's no mechanism to allow you to do that. You're in a constant terror that your competitor, actual or potential, will come up with something that outmaneuvers you in one way or another, legal, illegal, it really doesn't matter once the competition gets going. What they're trying to do in England is basically say that there ought to be, at the very least, a major sector of our modern economies which doesn't run under that pressure, where other variables like the quality of life at the workplace for the people who are there, the quality of the environmental impact, the quality of the kind of growth and the dispersion of the benefits of growth across the population, that these values are at least as important, if not more important, than the profitability that in the end accrues to the relatively small number of people that are owners of stocks in corporations, etc. And that the hope is, and the goal is, that a segment of the economy, a big one, that works like that, will allow us a kind of laboratory experiment to let the people of modern societies, Britain, the United States, wherever, to see how these differently run economic organizations work, to decide where we would prefer to spend our work lives in a democratically run, collective, machine-run but democratic enterprise organization, or the kind of top-down hierarchy we're all used to, whether we want to buy products from the one kind of production system or the other, and in that way vote with our dollar purchases. Then we would have a society being able to look and experience at these alternatives to then decide whether it wants to go the one direction or the other, or indeed even mix the two together in a proportion that makes sense. Maybe you'd want to leave some things governed by the profit motive and other things clearly not. But in order to see that, you have to do what the British Labour Party is now considering, which is to make a governmental commitment, a social commitment. And the Labour Party has said that if Corbyn wins and becomes a new prime minister, they will do this. They will say to every firm, you can't go abroad, you can't sell out to another company. If you stay the way you are, you can stay the way you are. But if you propose a change, you have to do something first. You have to give your own workers what's called the right of first refusal. Those workers would have the right to buy the company at the going market price and convert it into a worker cooperative run democratically. And when the question is asked, well, how in the world would the workers ever get the money to be able to do that? Corbyn's answer is, that's where the government comes in. We will lend it to them because we're committed to having a worker co-op sector of our economy so that the people will finally see and be able to make an informed choice.
Now, in the United States, we're seeing some really good news with regard to democracy. For example, Maine, the people of Maine voted to have ranked choice voting, instant runoff voting. The Maine legislators tried to block it. Both Republicans and Democrats hate it because it breaks up the two-party monopoly. And the Maine Supreme Court just said, no, you've got to have this. So we're seeing, you know, lots of changes, small d democratically across the country, but not so much economically. How do we get this message into the mainstream thinking with regard to the economy?
Well, I've been working on it, as you know, for quite a while, and I am very happy to tell you that the interest in worker co-ops, the interest in converting work situations, bringing democracy to the workplace, to say it in the simplest way I know how, is more interesting to more people than ever in my lifetime in the United States right now. I think it's a reflection, more than anything else, of an awareness, especially since 2008 and 9, that the capitalist system, whatever else you think it may have achieved, is now dividing this country into a haves versus have-not situation that is frightening not just the people who don't have, but even the more sophisticated and reflective members of the core part of the population that does have, from Warren Buffett on down. And I think what you're seeing is a growing recognition that, yeah, we need to have a new and different way of doing our economic business. And here in New York, for example, we have the single largest worker co-op in the United States, Women in the Bronx, who have now 2,000 strong, operating a cleaning and growth business that has been extraordinarily successful and is run very carefully as a worker co-op.
That's great. Professor Richard Wolff, hang on just a second here.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Dr. Wolf's website, democracyatwork.info. You can tweet him at Prof. Wolf. His latest book, Capitalism's Crisis Deepens. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Tom. Have a good day.
Thank you. You too. And welcome back, Steve in Phoenix, Arizona. Hey, Steve, thanks for watching Free Speech on the Dish Network. You wanted to get back to our topic of racism from the first hour?
Yeah, if I could,
please.
Tom. I'm glad to see you apparently are looking a little better and feeling better.
Yeah, slowly but surely. I still have a tickle in my throat, but I'm getting there.
Wow. Yeah, I hope you were able to enjoy Hawaii a little, but I got a feeling you didn't.
No. Well, you know, it wasn't bad. It wasn't. You know, it's no fun when you're sick. Louise was sick too, so we just both kind of hung around in our hotel room for 6 days, and yeah, felt. But anyhow, Steve, thank you for asking. What's up?
Certainly. You know, I can certainly empathize. You know, with the blacks and their situation. You know, back in the 70s, when I was in Wisconsin working in a factory, back in the day there, I had a great big afro and a beard. Big beard, and it wasn't quite as big as Kaepernick's, but it was pretty good size. And you know, I got quite a bit of flack from some of these old white coworkers, and you know, they says, I won't say it, but they said, you look like an N-word, you know, yeah. And why don't you shave that or you know, cut that dang thing, you know?
Yeah.
And another interesting thing I had kind of a reverse thing down here. And back about when Trayvon Martin, or 2012 approximately maybe, I was one morning I was out walking, and before I had cleaned up and all that, and it was cold out. It was wintertime, and you know, in a gated community here, and I had a hoodie on, and I looked kind of grungy, and this and that. And I was walking down a side street, you know, in the community here, by a canal, and lo and behold, here comes up the security guard, and a roving security guard. He's driving down the street, and he asked me, he says, "Can I help you?" And I thought, why is he saying that to me? And you know, and I said, I got a little hot with him, and because I felt I was being profiled. And we had a few words, and then I thought, you know, this isn't going nowhere, and we wound it down. And then after this experience went by, I thought to myself, you know, if I would have been black, and this would have been a white guy, and he had a gun, I could have been killed.
Yeah.
And that's when it kind of really hit me. And I'll tell you, one of the neighbors we've had at one time was black, and which is unusual in a predominantly white community. And he was one of the nicest people we ever had.
Yeah.
You know, so I don't really have a whole lot more to add, Tom, but I just thought that was a little.
Yeah, well, it's great that you're collecting those insights, Steve, and I think that a lot of white people are starting to notice things like that, and
I hope so. You know, hearing from that couple of those gals there, I can't remember their name this morning, but they had some really compelling and stunning stories.
Yeah, and learning from people what the depth and strength of our own white male privilege is, Steve. I mean, that's I think the vast majority of white men, they didn't, and I was like you. I never even realized it existed till probably 10 years ago or so. You know? Yeah. I was in my 30s, I think at least, and it you know, it takes a while to figure this stuff out if you're living in this white male bubble. Steve, thanks for the call. Thanks for sharing your story with us. We'll be right back. It's 22 and a half minutes past the hour. There's a lot on the plate here, on our topic table, as it were. We've obviously in the first hour we were talking about race and gender in the United States, about racism and misogyny, and how it plays out, and how it's been basically embraced by the conservative movement and specifically the Republican Party in a very overt way. Ever since Paul Manafort was working with Ronald Reagan and then George Herbert Walker Bush, Paul Manafort and Lee Atwater putting together the Willie Horton ads. Paul Manafort advising Don Trump Jr. that his first public speech on behalf of his dad should be in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where the 3 civil rights workers were murdered, and he should talk about states' rights. He basically gave Reagan's speech, which Reagan did in 1980, the same speech, the same place. And this embrace of racism by the right is problematic, not just because it's so politically corrosive, but also because it's culturally corrosive, because it is damaging our country to have a political party use hatred. I was going to say use race, but this goes way beyond race. This is hatred or fear of women, of people of color, of people who look like they're of Arab descent, right across the board. To use that as a political weapon is nuts. It's so wrong. I mentioned at the top of the show that I had some Trump news here. I just want to share these with you, and then we'll pick up your phone calls. Actually, I think we got about a minute left before we hit a break here, if that. So just real quickly. Rod Rosenstein, Congressman Mark Meadows and Congressman Jim Jordan, Republicans from North Carolina and Ohio, respectively, are reaching out to Rosenstein and saying, we want you to provide us in Congress with a whole bunch of documents that have to do with the Hillary Clinton investigations, right? Now, why would they do this? It turns out, in all probability, that the reason they're doing this is not because they want to have an investigation into Hillary Clinton, but because Rosenstein has already turned those documents over to Mueller. It's part of the Trump-Russia investigation. Donald Trump reached out to Russia publicly and asked them to hack Hillary Clinton. And so they know that Rosenstein can't give them these documents. And then when they don't get the documents, they have overtly threatened to impeach him. House Judiciary Committee Chairman Bob Goodlatte, Republican of Virginia, says he intends to issue a subpoena for these things. And they want, Jerry Nadler, the Democrat from New York, says what they're doing is they're looking for an excuse to hold Rosenstein in contempt of Congress so that they can impeach him. They will do what Trump is afraid to do. We'll be right back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
We'll be back with your calls after this. The Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. This is an 1856 first English translation edition of this author. But you can still get it online, and a lot of different booksellers sell it. This is from chapter 11. What sort of despotism democratic nations have to fear? I had remarked during my stay in the United States that a democratic state of society, similar to that of the Americans, might offer singular facilities for the establishment of despotism. And I perceived, upon my return to Europe, how much use had already been made by most of our rulers of the notions, the sentiments, and the wants engendered by this same social condition for the purpose of extending the circle of their power. This led me to think that the nations of Christendom would perhaps eventually undergo some sort of oppression like that which hung over several of the nations of the ancient world. But it would seem that if despotism were to be established among the democratic nations of our days, it might assume a different character, different from the Roman Empire, for example. It might be more extensive and more mild. It would degrade men without tormenting them. I do not question that in an age of instruction and equality like our own, sovereigns might more easily succeed in collecting all political power into their own hands and might interfere more habitually and decidedly within the circle of private interests than any sovereign of antiquity ever could do. But the same principle of equality which facilitates despotism tempers its rigor. When no member of the community has much power or much wealth, tyranny is, as it were, without opportunities or a field of action. As all fortunes are scanty, the passions of men are naturally circumscribed, their imagination limited, their pleasures simple. This universal moderation moderates the sovereign himself and checks within certain limits the inordinate stretch of his own desires. Independently of these reasons, drawn from the nature of the state of society itself, I might add many others arising from causes beyond my subject, but I shall keep within the limits I have laid down to myself. Democratic governments may become violent and even cruel at certain periods of extreme effervescence or of great danger. Excuse me, think of George Bush and 9/11. But these crises will be rare and brief. When I consider the petty passions of our contemporaries, the mildness of their manners, the extent of their education, the purity of their religion, the gentleness of their morality, their regular and industrious habits, and the restraint with which they almost all observe in their vices, no less than in their virtues, I have no fear that they will meet with tyrants in their rulers, but rather guardians. I think then that the species of oppression by which democratic nations are menaced is unlike anything that ever existed before in our world. Our contemporaries will find no prototype of it in their memories. I am trying myself to choose an expression which will accurately convey the whole of the idea I have formed of it, but in vain. The old words, despotism and tyranny, are inappropriate. The thing itself is new, and since I cannot name it, I must attempt to define it. I seek to trace the novel features under which despotism may appear in the world. The first thing that strikes the observation is an immutable multitude of men, all equal and alike, incessantly endeavoring to procure the petty and paltry pleasures with which they glut their lives. Think now of a television society. Each of them, living apart, is as a stranger to the fate of all the rest. His children and his private friends constitute to him the whole of mankind. As for the rest of his fellow citizens, he is close to them, but he sees them not. He touches them, but he feels them not. He exists, but in himself and for himself alone. And if his kindred still remain to him, he may be said at any rate to have lost his country. Above this race of men stands an immense and tutelary power, which takes upon itself alone to secure their gratifications and to watch over their fate. Facebook? That power is absolute, minute, regular, provident, and mild. It would be like the authority of a parent if, like that authority, its object was to prepare men for manhood, but it seeks, on the contrary, to keep them in perpetual childhood. It is well content that people should rejoice, providing that they think of nothing but rejoicing. For their happiness, such a government willingly labors, but it chooses to be the sole agent and only arbiter of that happiness. It provides for their security, foresees and supplies their necessities, facilitates their pleasures, manages their principal concerns, directs their industry, regulates the descent of property, and subdivides their inheritances. What remains but to spare them all the care of thinking and all the trouble of living? Thus, it every day renders the exercise of the free agency of man less useful and less frequent. It circumscribes the will within a narrower range and gradually robs a man of all the uses of himself. The principle of equality has prepared men for these things. It has predisposed men to endure them and oftentimes to look on them as benefits. I have always thought that the servitude of the regular, quiet, and gentle kind, which I have just described, might be combined more easily than is commonly believed with some of the outward forms of freedom, and that it might even establish itself under the wing of the sovereign of the people. Our contemporaries are constantly excited by two conflicting passions. They want to be led, and they wish to remain free. As they cannot destroy either one or the other of these contrary propensities, they strive to satisfy them both at once. They devise a sole, tutelary, and all-powerful form of government, but elected by the people. They combine the principle of centralization and that of popular sovereignty. This gives them a respite they console themselves for being in tutelage by the reflection that they have chosen their own guardians. And it continues. It's a brilliant book. A Democracy in America. The Thom Hartmann Program. TC in St. Louis, Missouri. Hey, TC, thanks for listening to Sirius XM. What's on your mind today?
Thank you, sir. Thank you. This Caucasian male privilege, and remember I said Caucasian male privilege, it exists especially in the Republican Party. And the question I have is, what are they afraid of? As you mentioned earlier, it started, I guess, a little bit over 50 years ago with Richard Nixon, and it really exploded with Ronald Reagan, as you mentioned, kicked off his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, letting good old boys know that there's going to be a new sheriff in town, new day, it's all right to be racist and bigot again. So what are Caucasian males, especially Republicans, what are they afraid of now? You constantly hear this is the greatest country that ever existed. It's the greatest country in the world. So if you honestly believe that, and I agree that it is, but what are you afraid of? We could be so much more as a country. And I think a young lady called earlier and mentioned that Mitch McConnell and the Republican Party, before President Obama even put his hand on a Bible to take his oath of office, they were conspiring to see what they could do, not to help the country, but to stop, hurt, and hinder him and whatever he tried to do for the country. So to all your
listeners,
listeners,
the caucus room conspiracy, yes.
Just think how much better this country could have been if they had worked, talking about the Republicans, had worked with them at all. And even the great John McCain, I think it was 8 senators that came up with a proposal, and President Obama looked at it and said, this is a pretty good idea. I'll go along with this. And those 8 Republican senators ran away from their own proposal. Racism, and until we deal with it, and it's going to take people like you and other Caucasian males to deal with this issue of racism.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome. Thank you, TC. You ask, and TC asked the question, you know, what are Caucasian males afraid of, or pink people? We have been sold on sexual fear of minorities, on some sort of mythology that black men are sexually more potent than white men, and therefore they represent a threat to us. And the way that this was sold to us in the 30s, in the 20s, 30s, 40s, was with the whole reefer madness thing. Those black people are going to smoke pot and rape the white women. And of course, it goes way back before that. I mean, Emmett Till was murdered, brutally murdered, because he was alleged to have whistled at a white woman. This sexual insecurity has been a major piece of the selling to white men of fear of black men, number one. Number two, the insecurity, the fear that you can't protect your own home and family. Now, when Donald Trump talks about Mexicans, and again, you know, people of color, he's selling these same fears. Historic, you know, Ronald Reagan directed them almost exclusively at black people, his welfare queen stuff, everything else. Trump said, hey, you know, brown people too, right? Hispanics. And I realize these color generalizations can be cringeworthy, but I'm not sure exactly how else to say this. Trump expanded that and said, you need to be sexually afraid of Mexicans. You need to also be physically afraid of them. They're not just going to rape you, they're going to kill you. Hey, these Mexicans, they're sending their worst. They're sending rapists and murderers, remember? And then, of course, there's the economic insecurity. And again, Trump is selling that, again, directing it towards Hispanics, but they're going to take your job. And the one common denominator among all 3 of those fears is the word they. That somehow people whose skin color is different than pink people are an other. that they're not fully human, that they are different than the dominator class, the white male class that controls this country. And frankly, I believe, and I could be wrong on this, but I believe that the only way we're going to break through this is to shatter that misconception, that cancerous lie, that somehow there is a fundamental difference between people because of the color of their skin, when in fact we are all human beings. And I realize it's a cliche to say, you know, we all bleed red or whatever, but it is real. We all have the same limbic brain. We all experience the same emotions. We all feel pain the same way. And that's one of the things that's so bizarre to me is the studies done in the United States, and I'm sure that they could be probably replicated in other countries, that show that when black people show up at emergency rooms, they're given fewer pain medications than white people. This, you know, for example, and it's not like malice, it's just this belief in some kind of difference. There isn't a difference. I mean, yeah, there's a few genetic conditions that you know, overrepresent in white populations like cystic fibrosis, or overrepresent in black populations like sickle cell anemia, but those have nothing to do with our essential humanity. We're basically all the same. And you know, it's like people need to get with the program, figure this out. Ron in Berrien Springs, Michigan. Hey, Ron, thanks for listening to WCPT. What's up?
Well, Tom, I wanted to talk about this. This leads into racism and also feminism. But we're coming up on the anniversary, May 24th, 1990, of the FBI's bombing of Judy Barr and Earth First in Redwood, California. The agent in charge who was forced to retire, Richard Held, he was also instrumental in the 60s and 70s in the COINTEL program, where he disrupted the American Indian movement, the Black Liberation movement. He's responsible for putting Geronimo Pratt in prison. And so if we're looking for the FBI as some kind of saviors for us, we are sadly mistaken. They are a criminal organization, plain and simple.
Was this, Ron, was this all before or after J. Edgar Hoover retired?
Oh, well, J. Edgar Hoover, he would have been in charge in the 60s and 70s. And you bring up J. Edgar Hoover, the very beginning of the FBI is shrouded in deceit and lies. If you read the book, Dillinger, Dead or Alive, by Nash, the FBI never did kill Dillinger. And that was, if they had been exposed by not killing Dillinger, Hoover would have been fired. So that lie had to be perpetuated from that time till this day.
Okay.
So the FBI is built on lies, deceit, and criminal activity.
Okay, I get it, Ron. Thank you for the call. Janet in Ypsilanti, Michigan. Hey, Janet, what's up?
Hi, Tom. Let me take you off speaker. Yeah, I live in FC. I'm a brown-skinned woman, and you know, I grew up with Mexicans and white people, and I married a white guy. It, you know, didn't mean much, you know, wasn't a big deal. So when I was in public with my children, because they both came out white, I'm brown-skinned, but I'm mostly Native American. So people don't know genetics, you know, and they just make major assumptions.
Right.
And so all the time, my kids, it finally got to the age where they spoke up. But when they were little, people would say, "Oh my God, those are beautiful children you're keeping." All the time I got that, all the time.
You're the second woman of color to share this story.
She's why I called, because I'm like, oh, yeah, you know, because my children were a different color than me.
Right.
And my husband lost out on promotions because his boss, you know, the company was from Texas, and they said to him, "Well, we think you'd be great for this position, but you married wrong."
In other words, you can't bring your brown-skinned wife to the cocktail parties that we have with our clients, kind of thing.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Jeez.
Yeah. I mean, I actually. Still, I mean, my kids are in their 30s and they're still beautiful, but I must say that if they're like attempting to get a new job or doing anything major, when my son went in the Navy, I just said, don't mention me. Don't show pictures of me. Don't tell anybody, because they'll chastise you.
Wow.
You know, and my son, you know, how does kids, they stand up and I mean, they're just like, well, Dad was Irish, Scottish, and English, and Mom is Native American, French, and Black. And they just spout that. I mean, they're proud of it.
Right.
But I worry for them because I know the world I brought them into, and I still feel nervous and sick about it. And the worse it gets, the more I want them to hide me, because I don't want to ever get in the way of their progress, you know? I mean, this country is crazy, and if we don't bond together pretty soon, because it's going downhill. I mean, we've got the environment that is really in trouble and just a moron in charge of it. So we're in trouble as a people. And if we don't bond together soon, this is going to be a catastrophe.
Yeah. This has got to be such a difficult thing for a parent. I can't imagine.
Yeah. I mean, you know, it hurts your heart, but, you know, I've had a life of it, so it's not, you know, it's just something, I don't take it for granted. I just expect it. I really do. But I fear for my kids. I mean, my husband wanted to have kids. I didn't really want to have kids because I knew this world.
Yeah.
But, you know, they're here, and I love them. But, wow, I just try to hide so that I don't get them in any trouble.
That's a tough one. Janet, thank you for sharing your story with us. It's a really important one. I appreciate the call. Thank you so much. We'll be back. We're going to check in with Talk Media News. I believe Bob Ney is going to drop by and in about 4 minutes, so stick around.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archive.
And then in the third hour of our program, we'll get back to some of the news of the day, and we'll continue taking your calls on race, on Professor Wolf, on all the things that we've talked about today. And welcome back. Let's see here. Cliff in Canyon Country, California. Hey, Cliff, what's on your mind? Thanks for watching Free Speech.
Good morning, Tom. I'm sorry I'm so off topic here. I really enjoy the racism talk, and it's really been great. But I won't be able to call tomorrow. This call would be anything goes Friday call, but I'm busy the morning, so I figured I'd try you today.
Cliff, under any other circumstances and in the future, I would drop your call right now. And this is Arthur should have told you this. We try to keep people on topic. But Arthur let you through, so here you are. What's up?
I deserve to be dropped, and if you want, I'll call back next Friday.
No, go for it. Go for it. You want to talk about Harvoni?
Yeah, well, in 2002, I got diagnosed with Hep C after a blood test, and at that time, the only cure that was offered was that interferon. And it had the side effects where it made you feel like you had the flu.
Oh, it was brutal. My best friend's wife went through that, and it did not cure the Hep C, and it nearly killed her.
Right. A lot of people don't even get cured with it. So I chose not to even try the interferon. I actually went to a chiropractor nutritionalist, and for about 10 years with vitamins and supplements, and I quit eating red meat and pork about 16 years ago, and no alcohol and all those things. And it kept my viral count pretty stable for about 10 years. You know, it was around 2 million. Some people, their count gets up into the 10 millions and whatever. Sure. So it did well for a while. But then after going to my doctor and having some blood work and ultrasound, he said that the fibrosis in my liver was stage 4, and that's the only way that I could get on Harvoni, because they won't let you get on unless your liver is in that condition.
Well, the Harvoni people will let you get on no matter what. You're talking about your insurance company won't pay for it unless,
correct,
which is bizarre. Correct. The insurance company says, if you're dying, we will pay for the treatment. But if you're not dying, we won't pay for the treatment that'll prevent you from dying.
That's a catch-22 pretty much. But so I qualified for Harvoni. I did 12 weeks. And this was a few years ago. So every 6 months I get my blood work done and get an ultrasound. And every 6 months it's undetectable. Yeah. So when they say Harvoni cures Hep C, what that really means is that it's no longer detectable on the blood work.
Right. And there's a 90% cure rate for it, by the way.
At least, yeah. But also I think the total cost was about $90,000.
Yep.
something like 30,000 every 4 weeks or something.
Yeah. So what's your
But,
point, Cliff?
I mean, I'm great, Tom. I'm
why
healthy.
did you call? What did you want to share with us?
Well, the fact that I think you had mentioned the first couple of years Gilead came out with Harvoni, their profits were astounding.
Yeah, they were $14.5 million in sales, or $1 billion in sales. Now they're down to $4 billion in sales.
Yeah, but I think, didn't you mention something that you think a lot of people that had Hep C got cured?
Yeah, yeah. Apparently you're one of them.
Yeah, I am one
And
of them.
good on
I'm
you.
really thrilled about it. But the problem is a lot of people don't know they have the virus.
Oh, yeah.
So that's, we don't know how
people
many people
got it,
know they have it.
back in the,
Yes,
I mean, I remember as a kid, my dentist never wore gloves, right? It's like, it's like, and that's how these things get passed around. And so it's just, yeah. Cliff, thanks for the call. And yeah, it should have been Friday. We'll be back. It's coming up on 10 minutes before the hour. We're going to check in with Bob Ney with Talk Media News and find out what's going on in the world today. We'll stick around. We'll be right back. Media News and find out what's going on in the world today. This report brought to you by goatsfortheoldgoat.com and Loving What You Do, Ellen Ratner's new book. And Bob Ney is with us with Talk Media News, the author of Sideswiped. Congressman, welcome back. Was India good to you? Did you get a lot of meditating in?
India was great, little trekking, meditating, and I talked to Ellen, who was in South Sudan, so we were on those ends of the earth.
Yeah, she was on our show from South Sudan on Tuesday.
Right.
Yep.
I wanted to mention something. Hepatitis C, which is $94,500 here, is $1,000 in India.
The treatment, the Harvoni treatment for
Yes.
And this is what other countries do. I mean, this is they keep track of, or they can take care of their citizens.
So a lot of Americans are going over. They're staying for a 12-week regimen, as I understand it. They're doing some touring, and the trip will probably cost them a grand total of $5,000, including airfare and hotel stay and the cure.
Whoa, I didn't know that. That makes perfect sense. If you don't have health insurance, or if your health insurance company refuses to pay for a $90,000 treatment for Hep C.
I have a friend of mine who called actually and asked me for details because he's in that exact situation. He has no health care, and that is what he's going to do. And with friends, they're going to give him $5,000, and that's what he'll go over and do.
Amazing.
Right. Oh, by the way, Tom, I was getting off the airplane yesterday, 4:50 in the morning, right, waking up after sleeping, coming from Delhi, and the last person on the right on the plane up in the first class section, I didn't know who it was, but there was one person left. And as I got about a foot away and I looked to my right, it was Rick Perry.
The Treasury or the Labor Secretary?
The Secretary of Energy.
Energy, that's right. Energy, yeah. The branch that he couldn't remember in his debate. I can't remember now, too.
He was all sleepy and I didn't say anything. I just got
Amazing.
I'd add that in there. Speaking of international, there's two stories here, and I don't want to make a conspiracy theory, but I've got a feeling on one of them. And they tie to the other. And this is both on Syria. Now, it was leaked from 4 anonymous, not 1 or 2 as usual, 4 anonymous government sources that we didn't achieve what we said we achieved with airstrikes in Syria. by any stretch of the imagination, is what they're saying.
Right.
It's still debatable, you know.
And we didn't a year ago when Trump did the same thing.
Right, exactly. And I thought about this because it was right on the heels, this leak came right on the heels of Senator Corker's hearing yesterday, in which, you know, both sides of the aisle, mainly Republicans, there was one Democratic member that, you know, was questioning about no plan or strategy in Syria, but in particular on the Republican side, of course, led by Senator Lindsey Graham, wanting the president to not leave Syria. And I just wondered about the timing of that report, you know, because, you know, it just, everything to me now, of course, smells of John Bolton. You know, is this a report leak so that we are forced to say, oh, we have to do more, we have to bomb more, we have to stay in Syria? I just wondered about that, you know, if that's a potential. I mean, who knows?
I don't know. It's a potential disaster, though. I mean, you've got at least 6 or 7 different, very specific factions who are fighting in Syria right now. This, you know, and getting in the middle of a civil war. I mean, we saw this with Vietnam. It's never a good idea.
Well, that's right. And, of course, you have the Saudis who want Assad gone. They don't care what happens after that. They could care less. Right. They'll try to use their money to even flow it towards terrorist forces, so they don't care.
Yeah, they're just anti-Alawite.
They don't care. And it's a proxy. And right now, you know, this Crown Prince, who's really the king, has gotten such unbelievable publicity on reforms that he's throwing out there, you know, just for the sake of publicity, when the guy's actually, you know, hard-fisting taking control of the entire kingdom and actually taking money from people. So, you know, I don't trust that side of the element. And then, of course, and I'll pick on Lindsey Graham because he's the one always wanting to, you know, go topple Assad. And then they would expect, as they did President Obama, to go in and get rid of the Iranians, get rid of the Russians, then get rid of Assad, and then who runs the government?
Yeah.
So I think we tried that once. It was called Iraq.
Yeah.
So we'll see what comes out of it, you know, with that. And speaking of international, of course, have you talked a lot about Nikki Haley today at all?
No, I haven't. Oh. Go for it.
I thought it was interesting because, you know, the White House, not the president himself through the normal tweets, but the White House through an advisor, came out and attacked her in a sense and said, you know, she basically was confused. Now, Nikki Haley, who at least a lot of sources have said had a private conversation with Trump when she took the job, making it clear that she would support the White House, but in fact would have her own ideas and speak her own mind. And she quickly retaliated at the comments and basically, you know, paraphrasing is don't patronize her. So I just thought it was interesting. I don't think she's going to be fired. I think she's got, you know, basically sort of the ability to do that.
I have heard that there are several Republicans, elected Republicans, who are talking about a Mike Pence, Nikki Haley challenge to Donald Trump in 2020.
Well, you know, I've heard that a lot about, in fact, people just speculating Nikki Haley will be on the ticket in 2020, assuming that, you know, Donald Trump is not going to be there.
Yeah.
One thing that is very interesting today, you know, Cohen, the president's lawyer, who's now in deep trouble, obviously, Cohen had this lawsuit against Fusion in the dossier and BuzzFeed, you know, because BuzzFeed published the dossier. This was the, quote, salacious dossier on Trump, and he had that lawsuit. He has now dropped that lawsuit. It's dropped.
That's presumably because he does not want to be subject to discovery. He doesn't want to be
find everything.
Right. He doesn't want to be deposed. Fascinating stuff. Bob Ney, it's great to have you back in the country, Bob. Thanks a lot.
Glad to be back.
Yeah. Thanks, and thanks so much for the news report. Bob Ney, author of Sideswiped, with us here on Talk Media News. We'll be back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Wines have some of the highest pesticide levels in our food chain. This hour brought to you by ecowine.com. Pesticide-free wines, organic wines, imported from France by the Organic Wine Company, ecowine.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally.
Call 800-568-9889 or go to thomsbeats.com. That's 800-568-9889, Thom's Beets, THOMSBEETS.com.
It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Travis Lupik's book, Fighting for Space, how a group of drug users transformed one city's struggle with addiction. This is from the introduction. In a beat-up old hotel, Mark Townsend watched one of his tenants, a woman named Mary Jack, crawl up the stairs, so crippled by the symptoms of withdrawal that she couldn't lift her body to walk. It was 1992, Townsend recalls, and doctors required a thorough examination and patient history before they would prescribe methadone to someone addicted to drugs. Often that took several days. How can we make this woman's life bearable, he remembers thinking. The rules were wrong, Townsend decided. He found a doctor who put Mary on methadone immediately. They broke the law. That still didn't solve Mary's addiction to heroin. She would struggle with that for many years, but they addressed her immediate pain and made her well enough to fight another day. Like Townsend, activists, healthcare workers, and some politicians in cities across America are realizing that they will have to break and rewrite the rules on how society addresses addiction. The continent is in the grips of an overdose epidemic. In 2016, there were an estimated 64,000 fatal drug overdoses across the United States, up from fewer than 15,000 20 years earlier. Roughly 75% of 2016 deaths were attributed to heroin and similar drugs like OxyContin and fentanyl. For people under the age of 50, an overdose associated with an opioid is now the #1 cause of death in the United States. Heroin has reached the middle class and suburban America. At the same time, public opinion is turning against the war on drugs. Many policymakers are beginning to look at addiction as a health care issue as opposed to one for the criminal justice system. One Canadian city has seen this sort of crisis before. In response, a grassroots group of drug addicts waged a political street fight for 2 decades to transform how Vancouver treats its most marginalized citizens. Beginning in the early 1990s, activists pushed the city to adopt a 4-pillars approach to addiction. Authorities would continue with the pillars of prevention, treatment, and enforcement, but also deploy a series of complementary programs described as harm reduction. The city defined it like this: the principles of harm reduction require that we do no harm to those suffering from substance addiction, and that we focus on the harm caused by problematic substance use rather than substance use per se. In Vancouver, the municipal government accepted that it could not immediately help every addict stop using drugs. Therefore, for those people who fail to get clean or who are simply not ready for that step, it would attempt to make drug use less harmful. Inherent in harm reduction is an understanding that it is not necessarily the drugs themselves that do the most damage to the users. The law and systems of prohibition, which make drug procurement and possession illegal, are what hurt the people the most. When a person addicted to cocaine injects with a dirty needle, it's not the cocaine that poses a risk of infectious disease, it's the syringe. So why not make a clean needle available? Yes, the risk of overdose remains, as does the much larger issue of addiction itself, but the potential harm of an infectious disease is removed. When someone uses heroin in an alley, hurriedly injecting for fear of police, it's not the drug that causes them to rush and miscalculate their dose, possibly leading to an overdose. It's their fear of persecution. If they were offered an injection site where they could take their time and use under the observation of healthcare professionals, the risks would be reduced. Again, the addiction remains, but if they overdose at an injection site and a nurse is there to monitor them, they live to make another attempt at long-term treatment. Harm reduction strategies are about keeping people alive and as healthy as possible. excuse me, until they can arrive at a place in their lives where treatment or abstinence works for them. Today, there are dozens of cities across North America at the point where Vancouver was in the 1990s. Toledo, Miami, and San Francisco, for example, have sprouted activist groups that are working with healthcare professionals to slowly warm public opinion to this issue. 90% of new heroin users are white. A rising number are middle class or wealthy, a U.S. official told Frontline on PBS in 2016. Quote, "It's been true throughout American history that when drugs penetrated into the middle class, the white middle class, politicians panic much more than they do when the drugs are concentrated in poor neighborhoods. It's not fair and it's not right, but that is the kind of country we are living in." Jurisdictions across the United States are looking to Vancouver's example with increasing interest. One of the founders of Vancouver's harm reduction movement, Mark Townsend, spent April 2016 in New York helping that city expand needle exchange programs. In October 2016, a delegation from Seattle visited North America's, excuse me, visited North America's first supervised injection facility, Insight, in Vancouver. In early 2017, former BC coroner and Mayor Larry Campbell was in Sacramento helping lawmakers draft notices that would allow for the establishment of supervised injection facilities in California. Interest in Vancouver's model has grown with the increasing severity of America's opioid problem. This book, Fighting for Space, is about people who have slipped through the cracks. It's about those who have suffered the consequences of addiction and prohibition and who did not have family or friends to help them get back up. It's about those who, for a myriad of reasons, failed with treatment and rehabilitation. It tells their stories and explains harm reduction for communities that are struggling with overflowing jails, crimes fueled by desperation, and people left to die in the streets. Fighting for Space by Travis Lupick.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Oh, a nice tweet. This is from Akinwumi Oyabade, who tweets, "Tom, your first hour has given me hope. Thanks so much for taking on a topic most of us are afraid to touch." That would be race. "As someone who has faced the same humiliation for simply shopping while black, it's painful, but one has to try to move on. Thank you, sir." Well, thank you. That was really, really nice comment. There's some really, you know, I get nice Twitter comments. I mean, excuse me, unlike the mother of the 4-year-old who wanted a female dentist, and then they came down on her like a ton of bricks. Ben Shapiro and his trolls. Maybe it's because I've selectively muted a lot of people, but I don't know what it is. Anyhow. I want to continue this conversation. Gene in Pittston, Pennsylvania, you wanted to weigh in on these issues. Gene, welcome to the program. Thanks for listening to WFTE.
Thank you. I agree. I appreciate your program, and I think it's great that we have this conversation. I know that my experience as being white is working with a lot of black people, working with a lot of people from different cultures. And in the beginning, I will see color. I will. And that's how I know that I have racism in me. I notice the differences. And then as you become familiar, you work together, you talk to each other about your, everyone's got problems in their lives, or they got stories to share or laughs to share about kids, their parents, whatever, going to school, just trying to get through the day at work. You find that you have more in common than you do. The differences kind of, erode. And you don't, after a couple of days, weeks, you don't see color anymore. You really don't. You say, that's my friend, that's my coworker.
Or instead you see the essential humanity of others, and that diminishes the impact of color.
Yes, and I think that a lot of it, of the fear and the hate, in some ways, comes from just not being around each other. just being separated, you know?
Yeah. And this is why segregation, you know, institutional, structural segregation, which has been obviously with this country literally since white people first appeared here in the early 1600s, 1607 or 1492, if you want to take it all the way back. This is why segregation is so corrosive and so destructive. Gene, very excellent point. Did you want to add something?
No, I was just saying, like, you know, I like that expression. We have to strive for our better angels, and segregation is bad for our spirit.
Yeah,
bad
it
for
is.
us as,
It is.
as humanity.
Very, very, very well said. Gene, thank you for the call. Lawrence in St. Paul. Hey, Lawrence in Minnesota. What's up?
St. Paul. Hey, Tom. Not so fast on the comment about the virility of the black guy. You might be right there. That's the only stereotype that I agree with.
Okay.
No, I was just kidding. Might have start off with a.
I hope you're just kidding, but you know, because you just scared a whole bunch of white guys.
Yes, it was a joke, but getting to the point though. Here's the thing, and you've laid this out perfectly, and your listeners, they've done a great job of adding to your theories. But here's the thing, and this is why the Democrats are going to lose again, because you had a caller on your show earlier this week. He was talking about, the Democrats need to change up talking about Donald Trump. We can't talk about him. We got to talk about jobs. We got to talk about education for all. And respectfully, this guy is totally off base. That's not going to win, because what's going to win is that we finally sit down as Americans and say, you know what, we got a problem with race, and the Democrats need to be the first to try to solve the problem of race in this country.
Yeah.
And that's what it is. It's not
well, the Democrats have taken that on. I mean, when Congressman Pocan said that, he was not talking about race. He was talking about Russia. He said, you know, if we think that we're going to get elected because people are upset that Donald Trump was colluding with the Russians, you know, that's not going to sway more than a handful of votes. But, you know, the Progressive Caucus, the Congressional Progressive Caucus, has always been, you know, a very, you know, a very positive force, I think, on race. And there are a lot of members of the Progressive Caucus who are also members of the Black Congressional Caucus.
Yeah, but why is the message getting lost though? Somehow the message is getting lost. They're not really.
Well, I think that to a certain extent they've incorporated the message, because there are so many people of color who are running for political office right now, and women who are being embraced by the progressives.
And that's true too. But don't you think we need to just sit down and kind of just have a salient discussion about this issue? And that's the only way we're going to solve it. And the first place we need to start is a couple of callers ago, he said, what are whites so afraid of? And here it is. They are afraid like any human. Let's go away from the human species. They're afraid of losing their privilege. That's a human condition. In other words, you're afraid of something new. So Democrats have to address that. White people, don't be afraid to lose something. You're not losing anything. Everybody's just being equal.
Yeah.
And that's what we need to address.
You're gaining a society that works, but part of the problem is, Lawrence, and this is, I mean, if you look at it from the point of view of poor white people in previously industrialized parts of the United States, you know, the three states where Donald Trump basically beat Hillary Clinton, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. If you look at those states and you look at the poor whites, because of deindustrialization, because Reaganism brought with it a very specific policy of moving our jobs to China. Arguably, Richard Nixon started that. He opened us to China. Because of that, you've got people who have been put into a condition, into a circumstance where they feel competitive. It's like on an airplane trip. You know, if people get upset because somebody moves their seat back, well, that's not because, you know, they're upset with the wrong person. They shouldn't be upset with the guy who moved his seat back in front of them. And I fly a lot, so I see this. They should be upset with the damn airline that put the seats so close together that when somebody moves their seat back, you get in somebody's face. So it's not black people or brown people are going to take your job. It's that a whole bunch of rich white people moved your job to China.
And that's exactly right. So how can the Democrats make that message that you just accentuated right there? How can we make that come home and make it very virulent to the masses?
Yeah. Well, it's going to be a challenge, Lawrence, because by and large, white people are uncomfortable talking about race and largely uninformed about race. And some of that discomfort is, and I'll cop to this myself, early on doing this program, is that white people don't know how to talk about race. They don't know where to begin. They don't want to sound like idiots. They don't want to sound like racists. Most, I would say, white people, even if they are racist, they don't want to sound like it. So
they don't want it.
Yeah, so we've got to figure out a way to have these conversations, and hopefully this show is some small contribution to that. But it really, this problem is one that white people caused, and white people are going to have to solve, because it is a problem with white people. It's not a problem with black people or Hispanic people or Asian people or Native Americans. This is a problem that white people caused, and a societal condition that white people brought about. And are going to have to do something about it. Lawrence, thank you for the call.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be back with more of your calls right after this. Welcome back. Shelley in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Hey, Shelley, thanks for watching Free Speech TV. What's on your mind?
Hi, Tom. Good morning.
Good morning.
And thank you so much for your program. I listen to you every day. And I wanted to share a memory of my childhood. Born a female Caucasian Irish girl, born and raised in Philadelphia. I do now reside in Albuquerque. But as a young child, say approximately 1969, as I said, it was a predominantly Italian neighborhood and mostly Irish, amongst other ethnicities. But as a child in 1969, there was a dark-skinned family that had moved in to the village across from the village that I was growing up in, and as a family that just newly moved into the village in the neighborhood across the road, as a child I saw the opportunity of they did have a female and a male child, and I saw an opportunity at a young age as a new friend. A new people that have moved into the neighborhood. And I remember at a young age that I would cross the road to the next village and just would walk and kind of sit on the sidewalk in front of their home, hoping, that the little girl would come out and I could make a new friend. At the time while this was happening, riots were breaking out in the area. People, protesting for having, dark-skinned family move into a neighborhood, and never quite understood that as a child. As might I say, in my mid-stage of life now, I am still the same person I always was as a child, that when will we ever learn from past history? We're supposed to be in a very intelligent human race here, and history just repeats itself, and not for the better.
Well, in a way, I mean, we have ended legal segregation in the United States. We haven't ended actual segregation. We have ended chattel slavery. We've done away with absolute white male privilege in that women are allowed to vote and encouraged to vote. And so I mean, I think we've moved in a lot of ways in a very positive direction. And even though we lionize Dr. King, we ignore his message, his more radical messages. His more important messages, frankly, or not more important, but his also very important messages about class and about the evils and dangers of capitalism, and we ignore that because nobody wants to acknowledge that capitalism has a racial piece to it. Slavery was capitalism.
Right.
But anyway, I'm sorry, Shelley, I'm starting to lose my voice here. But
that's understandable.
yeah, it's been a long couple of weeks. Shelley, thank you for the call. Thanks for sharing your story with us. We'll be right back.
Thank you, Tom. Have a great day.
Thank you, too. We'll be right back. It's coming up on 19 minutes past the hour. Michael in Winter Haven, Florida. Hey, Michael, what's on your mind?
Hello, Tom. I would like to propose that we stop looking at people as black and white. If you were to look at a white piece of paper or look at a black car, there is no human being on this earth that are either of those colors. And I know you struggled with the color thing earlier. I'm kind of brown-skinned. I'm Arabic and Sicilian. But I would propose we all came from the same place, whether you believe in creationism or accept evolution.
Right.
So we're all the same color with just different shades. And maybe if we looked at each other that way, it could maybe help a little bit. What do you think?
I absolutely agree with you, Michael. The problem is we've got all these artifacts of race built into our culture. And so it's, you know, using your metaphor, your model, it's not really not a metaphor, it's a reality. Using your model, how would you engage in a conversation about the different way that somebody with a lot of melanin is treated in a Starbucks, for example, and somebody with very little melanin, you know, the pigment that darkens skin, is treated in our society?
Well, that's a good question. I think if we could get people to stop, you know, it's used against dark-skinned people because, you know, nighttime is scary and the bad guy wears the black hat and all that stuff. I think it's culturally we accept that. So I don't know how to get that message out, but there just aren't any white people and aren't any black people. And I don't mean to demean either color.
Yeah. You're absolutely right.
I just wanted to put that out there. Maybe someone will hear it. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point, and well made, Michael. Thank you very much. Mary in Forest Lake, Minnesota. Hey, Mary.
Yes, hi, Tom. My issue is I've got some Muslims on one side of my family, and a number of, well, let's just say they're Islamophobes on the other side. And, you know, they'll say these Muslims are taking over the world and they're setting Paris on fire. They come up with all these fake news stories. I don't seem to be able to understand why this is offensive to me. And I'm wondering if you would have any kind of suggestion or comment about that.
Well, it's
kind of a little bit different in the black-white thing because there is an element of truth in that there are some terrorists among Muslims, but trying to get across that not everybody is the same.
Yeah. Well, first of all, more people in the United States since 9/11 have been killed by white conservative terrorists than have been killed by Muslim terrorists. And that's an important point to make to Americans, number one. But number two, what's going on, Mary, is that there is a group of people, broadly speaking, they're referred to as the Republican Party, who have decided that using race and using religion as a political weapon will help them achieve political power so that they can help out their billionaire patrons who will in turn enrich them. So you've got a bunch of politicians who are getting wealthy through a variety of means, with mostly money that's coming out of billionaire pockets, and a bunch of billionaires who want to change the laws of this country. They want to do away with environmental protections, things like that. You look at what Scott Pruitt's doing. He's dancing to their tune. And the weapon that they've chosen to use, or one of the weapons, the principal weapon that they have chosen to use, and really, really, kicked into high gear with the Reagan administration. And then when Barack Obama was elected president, they were like, oh, my God, this is wonderful. We can really use race now. And the weapon that they have chosen to use, or the weapons, are race, religion, and gender. And so what you are seeing in your family are that your Muslim members of your family are the victims of this smear campaign, and your Islamophobic members of your family are also victims of this smear campaign, but they don't realize it. They think that they're the ones who are standing up for, what's good and right in the American way and Superman and all that other stuff. And really what they are is they're suckers. Yeah.
Yes.
They bought this stuff, hook, line, and sinker, and it's not true. And, it's bad science, it's bad anthropology, it's bad sociology, it's bad if you fill in the blanks. It is just pure and simple, the use of race, religion, and gender as a political bludgeon. And it's just so wrong. Mary, thank you for the call. George in Palm Desert, California. Hey, George, what's up?
Yeah, hi, Tom. Thanks again for being there. Listen, what I get thrown in my face sometimes as a progressive liberal by some of these right-wing people is they go, well, look what the liberals and the Democrats have done to our educational system. It's been a total failure. And I must admit they have a bit of a point. Like, for instance, where I live, they spent $30 million on our local high school here, and 10, 15 miles down the street where the Mexican neighborhoods are, I don't think they've spent any money there that I know of over the past 20 years. So my question
Well, this has nothing to do with Democrat or Republican. This has to do with the structure that goes back to Reconstruction of making sure that schools are paid for by local communities. So poor communities have crappy schools and wealthy communities continue to have good schools. It's real.
Yeah,
it's really that simple.
And my question would be, is there a solution to that?
Sure. Right now, school funding in the United States, federal school funding in the United States is 9% on average. Right across if you take all the schools in the United States, public schools, 9% of their funds come from the federal government, and the balance comes from state and local taxes. And we need to flip that upside down. And, if you want to have a state and local contribution to the school, fine, make it 9%. And let the federal government pay the 91% like they do in every other developed country in the world.
Oh,
and
great.
Problem with that is that you'd have to raise income taxes, which means that you'd have a bunch of squealing billionaires. But, that's the solution. It's very simple. Just equalize it. In Finland, they don't have bad schools and good schools. In Germany, they don't have good schools and bad schools. In France, they don't have bad schools and good schools. Every school is pretty much the same. They're all funded to meet their needs. They may have special needs in a local community. You give them a little more funds, but, do what works. George, thanks for the call.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
We'll be back with more of your calls right after the break. It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today our book is George Lynn's Breaking the Trance. We're reading from Chapter 2. The title, Brains Awash in Adrenaline, What Overclocking the Brain Does to the Bodies, Minds, and Nervous Systems of Screen-Dependent Children. That would be as in computer and, phone screens. Quote, we design our games to hook them in. Part of the hook is how we build the games, to deliberately overclock their minds. Most people think at about 600 words a minute. We make them think at 1,000 words a minute. End of quote. This revelation was said in the course of a conversation with an executive of a large gaming company. This man thought that there was nothing wrong with what he was doing. In fact, he said, quote, "We hire PhDs in psychology to help engineer our games to be successful, to get kids stuck on them," end quote. In order for a video game or other screen medium to be financially successful, two things in terms of brain function should occur. It must be fun, which increases the availability of pleasure neurons in the brain, and it must create a strong tendency toward compulsive use. A screen medium must contain what game manufacturers term compulsion loops, meaning the game is programmed to pull children into the play and then repeatedly frustrate them while offering incremental rewards as they play, as the play proceeds through various levels. To build brain dependence on a particular screen medium, use of the medium has to be exciting. In terms of function of the human nervous system, it has to trigger the general adaptation syndrome, the GAS, also known as the fight or flight stress reaction pattern. When the GAS comes on, it blows vast amounts of adrenaline into the nervous system. Child and adolescent clients with bipolar disorder, as well as those with an issue with screen dependence, say they can actually feel adrenaline as heat rising upward from the midriff. Adrenaline is felt as excitement. It is this excitement that pulls a child into the pattern of chronic screen use and dependence. The brain develops long-term dependence on screen media use through the accumulation of the chemical precursor to adrenaline, which is dopamine. The following diagram provides an overview of how dopamine leads to dependence over time, and he's got a nice diagram of this. Dependence on a particular medium follows the chronic release of adrenaline. Even if the child becomes angry or frustrated playing a particular video game, the experience of adrenaline while in this angry state is felt as pleasure. Many of the children and adolescents we work with tell us that it feels really good to get really angry. For them, breaking things in a fit of angry frustration while playing a video game actually has a payoff. The payoff is an elevation in adrenaline, which feels good. The more adrenaline released, the greater the dependence. Research suggests that a massive multiplayer online role-playing game, MMORPG, is the most adrenalized screen medium. Examples are League of Legends, World of Warcraft, and Clash of Clans. But children may also become dependent on the experience of their minds floating through hours of YouTube videos or searching or surfing on Twitter or Snapchat as a behavior-shaping force, pushing their behavior in certain predictable directions. As adrenaline goes up, the brain goes into hyperdrive and the child experiences a period of enhanced focus on his screen media. As screen media use continues uninterrupted for hours, more disturbing results are seen. Research shows that these media present highly arousing, abnormal sensory inputs to the brain's activating system. Downstream effects of this arousal include a markedly decreased attention span, an increase in brain metabolism patterns similar to that seen in drug addicts, an increase in short-term aggression for violent video games, especially in younger children and boys, along with an increased likelihood of later antisocial behavior, deterioration of brain executive functioning, which includes remembering, planning, and inhibiting impulsivity, increased vigilance, irritability, and depression, sleep disorders, development of anxiety disorders, and the risk of receiving a diagnosis of ADHD at age 7 that increases with every hour of media use for young children. If a child uses recreational screen media for more than an hour a day, some of the downstream effects noted in the previous section will start to materialize. The brain can deal with screen media use in moderation, but if it is pushed by a compulsion loop, damage will occur. Chronic excessive screen time eventually exhausts the brain with the buildup of corticotrophin-releasing factor, CRF, that accompanies adrenaline. This neurochemical kicks the brain into high gear when so commanded by the stress reaction and stimulates the release of cortisol. Cortisol pushes the nervous system into action, but if stress goes on chronically, the presence of cortisol can result in damage to the brain's memory circuits and other structures tasked to attention, mood, and impulse control. As stated earlier, brain executive function is impacted by chronic screen overuse. Stress retards the function of the brain center tasked for memory, the hippocampus. And when this happens, the child's short-term memory will start slipping. He will forget things and become disorganized. His ability to think efficiently and solve problems or remember basic facts will slip. Homework hour becomes hell hour, with his parents trapped in the role of suspicious overseers. The brain can heal, but it needs time and cessation of the hyperadrenalized state for a period to recharge. If it does not get this relief, the kindling effect begins, causing the deterioration of brain structures associated with mood stability. Chronic play causes the child to experience anxiety and a mild to moderate irritable depression. Research on the impact of these mood states suggests that if depression or anxiety remains untreated, it becomes worse over time. The slow burn eventually engulfs the brain. George Lynn's book, Breaking the Trance. Here's an amazing piece of news. Apparently in Memphis, Tennessee, the Republicans just love their Confederate statues. They love those old slave owners, you know, like Nathan Bedford Forrest. He was a slave owner. He was a leader of the Ku Klux Klan. He was a general in the Confederacy. And he had a statue in Memphis. And the city fathers in Memphis took the statue down. And the Texas Republicans just voted to cut Memphis's budget by $250,000. We're going to stick it to the city, because how dare they take down a statue of a racist traitor? I mean, people, these guys, the Confederates are traitors. People talk about, oh, you got to fly the Confederate flag, the battle flag. That's the last flag the Confederacy was flying. No, the last flag the Confederacy was flying was a white flag. They lost. Somehow we have apparently not remembered that. Corky and Hilton. Hey, Corky, what's up?
Oh, yeah, I wonder, anybody figuring out that this is a criminal organization yet?
Which is?
Because the Trump organization, is any of your callers starting to figure it out?
Yeah, I think so, Corky, and well said. I went on the Fox News channel a few weeks ago and referred to the Trump crime family. And everybody who was on that segment acted like their heads just exploded. In fact, the host said, Trump crime family, what? And somebody just tweeted, I retweeted it, that ever since I was on, Fox News has been referring to everybody's crime family. It's the Comey crime family. It's the Rosenstein crime family. It's the, or whatever. I don't know the exact specific examples, but all their hosts now are using this crime family meme. They're trying to dilute it, I think, because we really do have the Trump crime family in the White House. John in Greeley, Colorado. Hey, John, what's up?
Well, thank you for having me on your show. I just think, as someone whose most of my heritage is from Europe, but I do have a little bit of Blackfoot heritage also. And when I was going to school, my mom did a little work to see if get a little financial assistance based on that. And in her work, has discovered that part of my family was actually considered to be property of the United States government because of being on an Indian reservation.
Whoa.
So I think I have an interesting perspective on, most people look at me and not think of my heritage being under ownership, where there are many people in this country whose that's not the case. And another thing that has kind of opened my eyes as to the whole idea of white privilege and so forth is that my wife is Hispanic, so my son is darker skinned than I am, and he got himself in a little bit of a trouble at one point in time. The policeman asked him for his name, and when my son told him his name, the policeman challenged him because he didn't give a Hispanic surname. And I've never been accused of lying when I told somebody my name. So that's, just a couple little things that I don't think a lot of people would instantly think about. But yeah, there certainly is a thing called white privilege. And even though it doesn't necessarily get you big advantages, but it certainly does exist.
Yeah. So you and your son look Hispanic? Was that your point?
I do not, but my son does. My heritage is enough European that I look like your average white guy.
So you pass.
But I do, yeah.
And your son doesn't.
And my son he's a very handsome young man, but he is darker skinned. So yeah.
Amazing. Amazing. All these stories we're hearing. This is remarkable. John, thank you for sharing your story with us. Albert in Marina Del Rey. Hey, Albert, what's up?
Hey, Tom, thanks for taking my call. Got 2 quick points. First, thank you for talking about the race issue. And, your callers have been excellent. However, I do have one complaint, and it's about white working class voters. I hate that term, and I don't know the percentages, but if I were to guess, more than half of whites voted for the Republican policies that made them ship jobs overseas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm really
Reagan was overwhelmingly elected and reelected by white people.
Yeah, so the poor whites, I'm really not too, I'm a human, so I want everybody to do well. But their woes and cries, I really should not.
Well, they got snookered.
Forefront.
They got snookered by the same billionaires that the rest of us got snookered by, at various times in various ways.
Right. But my second point goes on to the economy. And you had Dr. Wolf on, and he talked about the cooperatives, which I agree and disagree to a certain point. But I wish he would have talked more about inelasticity and elasticity and how that should relate to public goods and services. And basically what that is it's talking about how receptive demand is to price. And so when you have a good or service, let's just use water because Flint is a great example. Water is something that we all need. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor or what. We all need it. So no matter what the price is, we need it. So that's something that should be a public good. We should look at all goods and services that we use, such as the internet, and say, okay, if we all need it to survive or whatever the food, these are things that are in public interest. And if you use economies of scale, meaning since we all need it, we all should, pitch in whatever little bit we can, and it brings the overall cost of that good down.
Yeah, you're dancing around the edge of my rant on the Commons, Albert.
Oh, okay, yeah. So, but those are my comments, and thank you for your time, and thank you for the diving into the race issue. But I think we're a little too nice on the poor whites who did this to themselves.
Okay, Albert, noted, and I can't disagree with you. Well said, thank you. John in Rothdrum, Idaho. Hey, John.
Thank you for taking my call. I've been thinking about the prison system that we have. I used to work in the prisons trying to help prisoners be rehabilitated in the 60s, and it was a very rewarding occupation because they got out of jail and got on with their lives, and they weren't stigmatized or treated like they just gotten out of a concentration camp. And now that we have these for-profit prisons, we live in a society where we treat our animals, the humane society, more humanely than we treat the humans that are behind bars, and that's an atrocious.
If you look
reality.
Excuse me, pardon me. Finish.
And I think that we need to go back to a more humane way of treating human beings that are in for-profit prisons and get out of the concentration camp mode.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, John. And in that regard, Michael Moore's movie, Where to Invade Next, where he goes to Norway and checks out their prison system, is it'll make your head explode. It's brilliant.
He's in my corner all the time.
Yeah, he's a very good guy. And John, thank you. Very, very, very well said. But also, it's not just how our prisons are organized. It's our prison population. Before Richard Nixon racialized criminal justice, now obviously it was always racialized in the United States, but before he decided to use it as a political weapon to win the presidency and to get reelected with his so-called war on drugs, before Richard Nixon did that, our prison population was not that disproportionate to the rest of the world. And if you look at our prison population over the last 100 years, what you see is that in the late 60s, early 70s, it started to go up. It exploded in the 80s under Reagan, and it has continued to go up ever since. We are 5% of the world's population. We have 1/4 of the world's prisoners. And we're sitting around complaining about how many people Kim Jong-un has in his brutal prison camps. We've got a serious problem here. Marty in Evergreen Park, Illinois. Hey, Marty, what's up?
Hey, Tom, thank you for taking my call, and thank you for bringing up this topic. I'm a white guy in an interracial marriage with 4 children. And to start, I can't stress enough how my wife's family are just the most loving, devoted outstanding people I've ever known. My wife's aunt and uncle, essentially the matriarch and patriarch of the family, would serve as a role model to any human being in the world. But what I wanted to say is that, ever since Trump was elected, we're noticing a lot more racial divide than we ever did before. And I've been married for 10 years, and race doesn't really come up in a day. It always seems to be like an outside influence, but internally, it's just never really brought up as a thing. But I mean, I know that there are conversations I'm going to have with my son, and I'll have to have a talk with my son about how to interact with law enforcement because they're not white and will always be seen as not white. And one thing that drives me crazy is no matter how smart, accomplished, well-read, thoughtful, driven, there will always be some people that just cannot and will not see past that, and it drives me absolutely insane.
Yeah. Marty, thanks for sharing your story with us. It's a good one. And this is the, and I'm sure being not just married to a person of color, but having kids, interracial kids or biracial kids or whatever the proper word is, had to have been a heck of an education. Marty, thank you for sharing that. This is the process, right? We have to wake up white America, or pink America, or whatever, Caucasian America. We have to wake us up.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archive.
Because if we continue going down these roads of racial division and using racial hatred as a political weapon by the Republican Party, it's going to kill this country. Welcome back. Susan in Mercer Island, Washington. Hey, Susan, what's on your mind?
Oh, hi, Tom. Thanks for taking my call. I love your show. I was calling about the racism. Mm-hmm. And in my case, I'm white, and I'm married to a black man, and we've been married for 30 years, and we really didn't experience any overt racism that really bothered me. But this was an institute. Yeah. Nothing that bothered me like this. This bothered us so much that we decided to leave the country and go back to Africa, to Zimbabwe.
Wow.
It was, and in fact, 10 years later, we ran into one of the people involved through our kid again, because this involved our children, at a local children's hospital, a psychiatric college thing, we had ADHD. So when we ran into them, and I did it first, my husband was in the woods, I had something like PTSD from it.
You want to tell us what the incident is first?
My kids were on Adderall, and I had a neighbor who stole the medicine, and I didn't get it, but when I figured it out, I told them. That made us suspect. My husband was recently retired, a man in his 60s who's black, who'd worked at the White House, top security clearance, clearly a jock. But we were switching doctors at one point, and so a nurse claimed that my husband walked in and asked for drugs, which was bizarre. And so I asked the doctor in question, just what happened? He told me, and I said, well, that's what we thought happened. This is what they're saying. He said, that's insane. And I said, well, you help us clear our name. And he wouldn't do it. Eventually, he was on the board of that hospital. We're not Bill Gates. He didn't want to get involved. We had a meeting with the woman who made up this claim. At one point, looked at us and said, you seem like really nice people. And we said, well, stop doing this. Then whole hospital with us. We're severing all care for our kids. And I said something about the police came up, and I said, the police? They said, we won't call the police. I'm like, what? The whole thing was fabricated. And so it came, we left the country. I was afraid of doctors for years. I'd never experienced this. I think I took it much harder than my husband did, although like I said, when he came back from the woods and I told him how we'd run into this person who didn't first disclose that he'd been involved, I sort of rationalized it in the way that I do. And he immediately got angry and said the whole thing was so distasteful. I don't want our son connected to that guy at all. Yeah. Tell him no. We're not seeing him. But it was, I can't explain the humiliation, the devastation, and then the distrust. I remember one of the doctors involved said, what's too bad here is you'll never trust the medical establishment again. Right. So I was like creeping around the edges, and we went to Zimbabwe. We found what we thought was a doctor who he practiced here and didn't like our system. who could just think. And we were like, these doctors in the United States are so concerned about liability that they've parked their brains, and they're totally unaware of their institutional racism.
Yeah.
This was exactly what this is.
Yep.
A whole group of white men, some women, and I appealed it. They rejected it. Like I said, we didn't sue. And they just stood there with a straight face supporting this stare. And after they've gone and addicted so many people to opioids, it really infuriates me.
Yeah.
You know, and they just and they were so unaware of how racist they were being.
Yeah, yeah. Remarkable story.
Anyway.
Susan, I'm glad you're back. Thank you for sharing your story with us. I mean, hopefully, again, these stories are what wake people up, and it's so good of you, Susan, to share that story so candidly with our audience. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I used to bear it. You used to be afraid. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that now people are talking about. I have stories.
Amen.
Maybe more of the little.
There you go. Thom Hartmann Program. Rick in Weston, West Virginia. Hey, Rick, what's up?
Hey, what's up, Tom? I was born in 1954 in Prince George's County, Maryland. Now, as you know, that was a year that they turned, they made desegregate, the
Brown v.
School Act.
Board, yep.
All right. Now, I happened to be, when I was growing up, I had red hair and freckles. So I heard a lot of that stuff, howdy doody, better red and dead, pizza face, all that stuff. I learned from an early age what it was like to be discriminated against because you didn't fit into the mold, right? Now, my dad was a developer. He came out of World War II on a GI Act, just like your dad. And he was a Republican back in the day, but as years went by, as Vietnam went on, he changed. This whole idea of racism, I can remember, this honest truth, Tom, getting on a school bus, I believe it was 6th grade, and we lived in an integrated neighborhood, so I seen it from all sides. My dad wouldn't let me go to the junior high school prom because there was a girl, her parents from Hawaii, and they were both in the service because he wasn't different. But it's a genetic, is a ignorance. I've seen it from all sides. I ain't gonna lie to you. I've been in jail. I've seen it from both sides.
Yeah, I got it.
I think the it's like divide and conquer.
Yeah.
I'm going to tell you something.
No.
Today's Republican Party in 1970 wouldn't have a chance.
No, I agree. In fact, I would say that Dwight Eisenhower is rolling over in his grave. Rick, thanks for the call. Suzanne in Sacramento. Hey, Suzanne.
Hi. Your previous caller made me call you to mention there's a big connection between medical malpractice and racism. And rampantly, women, especially women of color, are having reproductive organs removed against our will. You go in to have a cyst removed, from a bladder, and they take out your ovaries. There is a film that's out. It was done on PBS about a woman in Southern California that had this happen, and there were a bunch of women in California prisons who had this happen to them. The legislature slapped the prisons on the wrist, but they did nothing about the issue. And the doctors that get involved, they refuse to help the patient. They lie, they falsify medical records, and no lawyer will represent women in these situations. Remarkable. And it's happening all across the country.
Remarkable. Suzanne, I'm going to have to dig more into that. I've seen articles over the, throughout my life, but I thought that they were anecdotal rather than systemic. Thank you for the heads up. Denise in Calumet, Michigan. Hey, Denise.
Hi, Tom. I've been hearing you talk about white privilege, and I finally realized that I've had an experience that makes me understand it better. When I moved to Colorado, I was teaching in a 32-bed ICU, and a lot of my students were from South Africa, India, all over the world, and they were my best students. They had learned English, one of them 3 months before she started the program. And the worst student I had was a white male. He would say he was doing the therapy he was supposed to be doing, and I would catch him in lie after lie. I gave him 3 chances, and I finally had to expel him. And the guy that watches cars in the underground parking place, caught him trying to knife my car. I had a Mustang I love Mustangs. And he called up to where I was working, and they had him expelled from the building.
Wow. Are you a person of color, Denise?
No, I'm a white woman from Calumet, Michigan.
Huh.
So that was like some of my first experiences with any kind of race, because where I come from in the UP, it's pretty much white.
Yeah, exclusively.
So my students loved me because I didn't think of them as colored. I thought of them as people, and I treated them that way.
Yeah.
And that's how we all should be.
Yeah, amen. Denise, thanks for the story. From Denise to Denise in Chicago. Hey, Denise, you have the last minute here.
Okay. I worked at a very, very known lawyer assistance program. I won't say it because it is known in Chicago. And one of my first jobs after college, they did not train me correctly. It was very strange how they trained me. So I go early every day, finish my job, romp around and ask everyone in so-called power for more work. This went on for a while, till finally I got called in, and supposedly I was put on probation. And again, I would come early and just push and push to get more work, till one day an African-American lady in another section, had nothing to do with our side, said, "Watch your back. Every person of minority has been fired." Sure enough, fresh out of college, I end up fired. And who calls me 2 days later? The young white lady of HR who said, "We're investigating." Unfortunately, I needed a job. I wanted to keep my first little apartment. I couldn't keep coming back, but they were investigating because every single person was fired.
Wow.
We've got to change. We've got to change in this country to see each other as people of value and work it that way. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Denise, for the call. That's, this is America. And if we're going to make it a better country, if we're going to make it a decent country, if we're going to be moral leaders in this world, if we're going to be the shining city on the hill that Ronald Reagan and John Kennedy and Bradford Winston, whatever his name was, the old preacher in the 1630s in Plymouth Colony, said we are, John Winthrop, excuse me, then, we have to start individually, you and me. We have to start these conversations. And particularly those of you who are white, we need to be talking to our white friends and relatives about these issues. Thanks so much for being with us today. We'll be back tomorrow. In the meantime, don't forget, democracy requires you. It's not a spectator sport. Get out there, get active, tag, you're it.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Wines have some of the highest pesticide levels in our food chain. This hour brought to you by EcoWine.com. Pesticide-free wines, organic wines, imported from France by the Organic Wine Company, EcoWine.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally.
Call 800-568-9889 or go to tomsbeats.com. That's 800-568-9889, Tom's Beets, THOMSBEETS.com.